Welcome to Tales by Imon. Tonight, we begin a new mystery, the cryptic note left at the crime scene. The rain in Veridia City had a personality of its own. It wasn't the gentle, life-giving drizzle of the countryside or the theatrical downpour of a summer storm. No, this was a cold, cynical rain that fell in relentless sheets, washing the grime from the city's concrete canyons and reflecting the neon glow of liquor stores and all-night diners onto the slick, black asphalt. It was the kind of rain that seeped into your bones and made you question your life choices. For Detective Jack Callahan, it was just another Tuesday. He sat in his unmarked sedan, the rhythmic slap of the windshield wipers doing a poor job of fighting the deluge. The car smelled of stale coffee and the faint metallic scent of resolved cases. Across the street, the building known as the Pinnacle stabbed at the bruised, purple sky. It was a monument of glass and steel, a place where old money and new tech collided. Tonight, it was also a crime scene. Jack took one last drag from his cigarette, the cherry glowing like a distant, angry star before he flicked it into a puddle. He was a man carved from the city itself, sharp angles, weary eyes, and a stubborn refusal to be impressed. He'd seen it all in his 20 years with the VCPD, from domestic disputes that ended in tragedy to elaborate heists that belonged in a movie. But a call to the Pinnacle, that was different. Trouble in this part of the city wasn't loud. It was quiet, precise, and usually involved a lot of lawyers. He pushed open the car door, the damp air hitting him instantly. He pulled the collar of his trench coat tighter around his neck and made a dash for the building's gleaming entrance. The lobby was an exercise in minimalist wealth. Marble floors, a single, imposing abstract sculpture, and a concierge who looked like he'd been genetically engineered to appear both bored and judgmental. "Detective Callahan," Jack said, flashing his badge. The concierge, whose name tag read Arthur, simply nodded towards the elevators, his expression unchanged. He'd already been briefed. The ride to the penthouse was silent and smooth. Jack used the reflection in the polished brass doors to study his own face. The lines around his eyes seemed deeper tonight. He ran a hand through his damp, graying hair. He felt old. The elevator doors opened directly into the apartment's foyer. The first thing that hit him wasn't a sight, but a sound, the almost deafening silence. It was a stark contrast to the usual chaos of a crime scene. No frantic family members, no blaring television. Just the low hum of the city far below and the quiet, professional movements of the forensics team. A young uniformed officer, Davis, stood guard. "Detective," he said, his voice low. "It's clean." Jack raised an eyebrow. "Clean." "In there." Davis gestured towards the main living area. Jack stepped past him and into a room that looked like it had been lifted from an architectural magazine. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic, rain-streaked view of Veridia City. The furniture was sparse and modern, the colors muted grays and whites. And in the center of it all, sprawled on a white designer rug, was Julian Croft. Croft was, or had been, a titan of the tech industry. His company, Nexus Dynamics, had revolutionized data security. Now, he was just another body. He was dressed in an expensive suit, not a hair out of place. There was no sign of a struggle. A single, dark stain was blooming on the chest of his crisp, white shirt. It was precise, almost surgical. His partner, Detective Maria Miller, was already there, kneeling beside the body but not touching it. She looked up as Jack approached, her expression grim. "Jack, glad you could make it. Traffic was a nightmare," he grumbled, his eyes scanning every inch of the room. "What have we got?" Victim is Julian Croft, age 48. Single gunshot wound to the chest. Small caliber by the looks of it. The ME will confirm. No shell casing yet. No signs of forced entry. The building security is top-notch. Keycard access only, and the elevator opens right here. Whoever did this either had a key or was let in by Croft himself. Jack crouched down, careful to stay off the rug. He looked at Croft's face. His eyes were open, staring at the high vaulted ceiling with an expression of mild surprise. Time of death. ME puts it between 8 and 9 p.m. The concierge saw him come up alone around 7:30. No one saw anyone else come up to this floor. Miller stood up, crossing her arms. "It's a locked room mystery, Jack. In the most expensive locked room in the city." Jack slowly circled the body, his gaze methodical. He looked at the half-full glass of whiskey on the coffee table, the sleek laptop sitting closed next to it, the shelf of first-edition books that were probably worth more than his house. Everything was pristine. Too pristine. Murders were messy affairs, fueled by passion, greed, or desperation. This felt sterile. It was an execution, not a conflict. "Anything missing?" he asked. Doesn't look like it, Miller replied. Wallets in his pocket, full of cash and credit cards. A watch on his wrist that costs more than my car. The apartment hasn't been tossed. If this was a robbery, they were the worst robber in history. Jack's eyes stopped on Croft's left hand. It was resting on his chest, almost as if he'd placed it there himself after being shot. But something was underneath his palm. Something white. Hold on, Jack said, pointing. Bag that. Carefully. A forensics tech with a pair of tweezers delicately approached. With surgical precision, he lifted Croft's fingers one by one. Underneath his hand was a small, folded piece of thick, cream-colored cardstock. The tech carefully picked it up and placed it in an evidence bag. Miller took the bag and held it up. Through the clear plastic, they could see elegant, calligraphic handwriting in black ink. It wasn't a long message. It was just a single, baffling sentence. Jack took the bag from her, his eyes narrowing as he read the words aloud. Where the silent king watches, the shadow will fall. He and Miller stood in silence for a moment, the only sound being the distant hum of the city and the soft click of a forensic camera. A king, Miller finally said, breaking the spell. What's that supposed to mean? A chess piece? A playing card? Or a metaphor? Jack countered, his mind already racing. He looked around the opulent room. Julian Croft was a king of his own empire. Was this a message from a rival? A disgruntled employee? Check his laptop, his phone. Run this phrase through every database we have. Poems, historical quotes, religious texts. I want to know what it means. Could just be the ramblings of a lunatic, Jack. Lunatics don't typically get into a high-security penthouse, kill a tech mogul with a single, clean shot, and leave a calling card on expensive stationery, Jack said, his voice low and gravelly. This wasn't random. This was a performance. The clean scene, the lack of struggle, and this note. He held up the evidence bag. This is the centerpiece. The whole reason for the show. He walked over to the immense window, looking down at the rain-swept city below. The countless lights blinked back at him like a million indifferent eyes. Somewhere out there, a killer was watching, waiting. A killer who played by a different set of rules and spoke in riddles. Where the silent king watches, he murmured to himself, the words tasting strange on his tongue. The note wasn't just a clue left behind. It felt like a challenge. A direct invitation into a game he didn't yet understand. This wasn't just another murder in a city full of them. This was the beginning of something far more complex and far more dangerous. And as the cold Veridia City rain continued to fall, Jack Callahan had a sinking feeling that the shadow mentioned in the note was just starting to stretch its long, dark fingers over his city. The headquarters of the Veridia City Police Department's Homicide Division was the polar opposite of Julian Croft's penthouse. Here, the only marble was the fake, cracked pattern on the linoleum floor. The air, thick with the smell of burnt coffee and desperation, was a chaotic symphony of ringing phones, clacking keyboards, and the low, constant murmur of detectives trading theories and complaints. For Jack Callahan, this cacophony was home. He sat at his battered metal desk, a styrofoam cup of coffee steaming beside a mountain of paperwork. The sun hadn't risen yet, but the office was already buzzing under the harsh fluorescent lights. In front of him, a high-resolution photo of the cryptic note was displayed on his computer monitor. Where the silent king watches, the shadow will fall. He'd been staring at it for 2 hours, the words looping in his mind until they'd lost all meaning and then, somehow, gained it back again with a more sinister edge. Detective Miller approached, dropping a thin file on his desk. She looked like she'd gotten at least a few hours of sleep, a luxury Jack hadn't afforded himself. Morning. Or what's left of it? Anything from the lab? Jack asked, not looking away from the screen. Ballistics came back. The bullet they pulled from Croft was a 9mm. Standard, common. Could have come from 100 different models of handgun. No unique markings, so tracing it to a specific weapon is a non-starter unless we find the gun itself. She tapped the file, and I ran the phrase from the note through every database I could access. Literary archives, historical records, religious texts, even conspiracy theory forums. Nothing. Not a single direct match. A few poems mention shadows and kings, but the phrasing is all wrong. It's not a quote, Jack. Or if it is, it's from something incredibly obscure. Or something personal, Jack mused, finally looking up at her. Something that only meant something to Croft and his killer. He took a sip of his coffee. It was bitter and hot, just the way he liked it. What about Croft's life? Let's build a profile. Enemies list. Miller pulled up a chair. That list might be long. I spent the last few hours doing a preliminary dive. Julian Croft wasn't just a successful businessman, he was a shark. He engineered at least 2 hostile takeovers in the last 5 years. Forced out his original co-founder a decade ago. He was brilliant, but he left a trail of financial bodies in his wake. Then there's the personal life. Divorced 5 years ago from a woman named Isabel Croft. It was messy. She fought him for every penny. No children. An angry ex-wife and a dozen ruined business partners. It's a start, Jack said, rubbing his tired eyes. Okay, let's divide and conquer. You track down Isabel Croft. See if her anger has been simmering for 5 years. I'll head over to Nexus Dynamics. I want to talk to his second-in-command, the COO. Let's see how broken up he is about his boss's sudden departure. Miller nodded. Got it. The COO is a guy named Elias Vance. He's been with Croft for 15 years. Supposedly his most trusted advisor. There's no such thing as a trusted advisor, Jack grunted, pushing himself to his feet. Only someone who hasn't found the right moment to stick the knife in. Nexus Dynamics headquarters was in the heart of the financial district, a sleek tower of smoked glass that seemed to absorb the morning light rather than reflect it. The lobby was silent, cool, and intimidating, manned by security guards with earpieces and impassive faces. It was another world, one of quiet power and immense wealth. Elias Vance's office was on the second highest floor, just below Croft's. He was a man in his late 40s, immaculately dressed in a tailored suit, with silver hair and a calm, composed demeanor. He rose as Jack entered, shaking his hand with a firm, dry grip. Detective Callahan. Thank you for coming. This is a terrible shock for all of us, Vance said, his voice a smooth, practiced baritone. He gestured to a leather chair opposite his sprawling mahogany desk. I can imagine, Jack said, sitting down. Mr. Vance, I need to know about Julian Croft. Who would want him dead? Vance gave a slight, humorless smile. Detective, a more efficient line of questioning would be to ask who wouldn't want him dead. Julian was a visionary, a genius. But geniuses are rarely pleasant. He was demanding, ruthless. He saw people as assets or obstacles. There are many individuals who would fall into that second category. Can you give me some names? Of course. Vance leaned forward, steepling his fingers. He proceeded to list, with remarkable clarity, 3 major competitors Croft had recently crushed, 2 high-level executives he had fired for perceived incompetence, and a venture capitalist he had publicly humiliated. It was a concise, well-delivered list of suspects. Almost too concise. You seem to have given this some thought, Jack observed. When you work alongside a man like Julian for 15 years, you become intimately aware of the enemies he collects, Vance said without missing a beat. It was my job to mitigate the damage he caused. Jack decided to change tactics. He pulled a photograph of the note from his coat pocket and slid it across the desk. Have you ever seen this phrase before? Heard Croft say it. Vance picked up the photo, his brow furrowing slightly as he read the words. He looked at it for a few seconds before placing it back on the desk with a dismissive air. No, never. It sounds like something out of a bad fantasy novel. It was found under his hand, Mr. Vance. The killer placed it there. Then the killer is not only a murderer but a melodramatic fool, Vance said, his tone cool and dismissive. Julian had no time for riddles or poetry. He dealt in data, in absolutes. This is meaningless theatrics. Jack stared at him, a familiar instinct prickling at the back of his neck. Vance's dismissal was too quick, too complete. It felt rehearsed. Perhaps. Or perhaps it was a message you were meant to understand. Vance's calm facade finally cracked, just for a second. A flicker of something, anger? Fear, crossed his eyes before being suppressed. That's a ridiculous assertion, Detective. I'm trying to help you find who murdered my friend and colleague. I suggest you focus on the legitimate enemies list I provided. Jack stood up. We'll be looking into everyone. Thank you for your time, Mr. Vance. As he walked out of the silent, air-conditioned office and back into the living, breathing city, Jack couldn't shake the feeling that Elias Vance knew more about the note than he was letting on. His denial was too strong. Back at the precinct, Jack found Miller staring intently at her computer screen. How'd it go with the Ice Queen? He asked, slumping into his chair. Isabel Croft has an alibi forged in iron, Miller said, looking frustrated. She was at a hospital fundraiser from 7 p.m. until midnight. On the stage giving a speech when Croft was killed. Spoke to a dozen people who confirmed it. She might hate her ex-husband's guts, but she didn't kill him. She swiveled her monitor toward Jack. But I think I found something else. I've been going through Croft's personal digital calendar. It's mostly encrypted business meetings, but I managed to get access. The screen showed a schedule for the day of the murder. It was packed with meetings, Nexus board call, Q4 projections, acquisition synergy meeting, standard CEO fare. But Miller had highlighted one entry. It was for 8:30 p.m., right in the middle of the estimated time of death. The location was simply listed as here. His penthouse. It wasn't the time or the place that caught Jack's eye. It was the title of the appointment. It wasn't a name or a subject. It was just a single, cryptic letter. K. Jack leaned closer, his tired eyes focusing on the screen. A single letter. K, he said aloud. Miller looked at him, her expression a mix of confusion and dawning realization. Vance gave you a list of rivals. Any of them start with K. Jack shook his head, his mind already connecting the dots. No. But this changes things. He looked from the single letter on the calendar to the photo of the note still on his desk, where the silent king watches. You don't think... Miller started. I don't know what to think, Jack interrupted, his voice low. But our victim had a secret meeting on the night he was killed. A meeting with someone identified only as K. K for king. It's too much to be a coincidence. We're no longer just looking for a killer. We're looking for K. The hunt for K began as a digital needle in a haystack the size of Veridia City. Back in the familiar cluttered chaos of the precinct, Callahan and Miller stared at a whiteboard covered in names. They had cross-referenced every contact in Julian Croft's digital life, employees, business partners, personal contacts, even food delivery accounts, with the initial K. The list was daunting. There was Kevin Lasky, a junior programmer fired 2 years ago. Catherine Bell, a former board member he had ousted. Kenji Tanaka, a rival CEO from a Japanese tech firm. The list went on, over 50 names, each a potential thread, each a potential dead end. We're casting the net too wide, Miller said, pacing in front of the board. She pointed to a name. Kevin Lasky has an alibi. He was on a flight to Seattle. Catherine Bell is 80 years old and in a nursing home. We could spend a month chasing down every one of these, and my gut says K isn't going to be on any official list. Your gut is right, Callahan agreed, leaning back in his squeaking chair. He took a long drink of cold, forgotten coffee and grimaced. The appointment was private, off the books. The single initial was for anonymity. This person wasn't on Croft's Christmas card list. This was someone from his secret life. A frustrating silence settled between them. They had a crucial piece of the puzzle, but no way to place it. They were stuck, and Jack hated being stuck. It felt like sinking in quicksand. The more you struggled, the faster you went down. He closed his eyes, picturing the penthouse, the body, the note. He had been so focused on the messenger, K, that he'd forgotten the other half of the message. His eyes snapped open. We're going at this backwards, he said, a sudden energy in his voice. We're trying to find a person to fit the riddle. Let's find the place first. Let's figure out what the Silent King is. Miller stopped pacing. You think it's a location? We already had uniforms check places like Kings Avenue and the statue of Martin Luther King Jr. downtown. Nothing. No, not a public place, Jack insisted, grabbing his coat. The note was left in his apartment. The answer has to be there. We missed something. I know we did. Let's go. An hour later, they were standing once again in the deafening silence of Julian Croft's penthouse. The crime scene tape was still stretched across the doorway like a cheap, yellow spiderweb. The body was gone, of course, replaced by a stark white chalk outline on the expensive rug, a ghostly echo of the violence that had occurred. The air was stale, the grand view of the city now just a muted, gray backdrop. Okay, Miller said, pulling on a pair of latex gloves. If we're looking for a king, where do we start? Art. Books. Everything, Jack commanded. Check the spine of every book. Look at every piece of art. Think like the killer. Think like Croft. What in this room could be a king? For the next hour, they moved through the vast space with methodical precision. Miller started with the impressive library, pulling books from the shelves, checking titles and flipping through pages. There were classics, biographies, and countless volumes on business strategy. She found a first-edition copy of Stephen King's The Shining, which she noted before placing it back. It felt too obvious, a misdirection. Jack, meanwhile, stalked the perimeter of the room, his eyes scanning every object. He studied the abstract paintings on the wall, searching for hidden crowns or royal figures. He examined the sleek, modern sculptures. Nothing. Frustration began to build in his chest. Was he wrong? Was Vance right? Was it all just melodramatic nonsense? His gaze fell upon a low-slung table near the window. On it sat what he had initially dismissed as a piece of decorative art. It was a collection of minimalist shapes made from polished metal and dark, carved stone, arranged on a smooth granite board. It was stylish, abstract, and blended perfectly with the room's decor. But looking at it now, with the riddle echoing in his mind, he saw it for what it was. "Miller," he said, his voice quiet. "Come here." She walked over, her brow furrowed in curiosity. Jack pointed at the collection of objects. "It's a chess set," he said. "A designer one. We were looking for a literal, medieval-style king. But Croft's king would be modern, abstract, just like everything else he owned." He reached out a gloved hand and picked up one of the pieces. It was carved from pure black onyx, a sleek, faceless pillar that tapered towards the top. It was heavy, cool to the touch, and radiated a sense of quiet power. It was utterly silent. "My God, Jack," Miller whispered, her eyes wide. "The Silent King." They had found it. The centerpiece of the riddle was right here, hiding in plain sight. A wave of adrenaline washed over Jack, clearing the fog of fatigue. "Okay," he said, his mind racing. "That's the first part. What's the second?" He held up the evidence bag containing the note, reading the words again. "Where the Silent King watches, the shadow will fall." "A shadow," Miller said, looking around. The room was brightly lit by the overhead recessed lighting, casting very few distinct shadows. "We need a single light source." She went to a minimalist desk in the corner and switched on a sleek, adjustable lamp. The room's main lights went off, plunging the penthouse into a world of sharp contrasts. Miller aimed the beam of the lamp towards the chess set. Jack carefully placed the Onyx King back in the center of the board. A long, distorted shadow instantly leaped from the piece, stretching across the floor and climbing up the far wall, which was dominated by a floor-to-ceiling bookshelf. "Move the light, slowly," Jack instructed. Miller carefully angled the lamp. As the light shifted, the shadow of the king moved like the hand of a strange clock. It swept across rows of books, a dark finger pointing the way. Jack watched it, his heart pounding a steady rhythm against his ribs. He felt like an archaeologist deciphering the code to a tomb. "Stop," he said suddenly. "Right there." Miller held the lamp steady. The tip of the shadow, now sharp and clear, was pointing directly at a specific spot on the third shelf from the top. It landed on a handsome, leather-bound edition of The Art of War by Sun Tzu. Jack walked over to the shelf. He pulled the book out. Nothing behind it. He then pulled out the two books on either side. Still nothing but the smooth mahogany of the bookshelf. He ran his hand along the wood, feeling for a latch, a seam, anything. His fingers brushed against a tiny, almost invisible indentation. He pushed. There was a soft, pneumatic hiss. A section of the bookshelf, about 2 feet square, clicked and then receded slightly into the wall. Jack pulled the section away, revealing a dark, square cavity. Set flush into the back of the cavity was the flat, gray face of a high-tech digital safe, its keypad dark and silent. They had missed it completely in the first sweep. It was a masterful piece of concealment. Miller let out a low whistle. "Well, I'll be damned." Jack stared at the safe. The pristine apartment, the ruthless business deals, the cryptic note, it had all been leading them here. To a locked box hidden behind a wall of books. Julian Croft, a man who lived his life in the public eye, had a secret world. And now, they were standing on its doorstep. "Whatever secret he and Kay shared," Jack said, his voice barely a whisper. "It's in there." They had found the where from the riddle. The question was, what secrets was the Silent King watching over? And what would happen when they finally brought them into the light? Getting a warrant to crack a safe, even one belonging to a murder victim, was a bureaucratic dance Jack Callahan knew all too well. It involved hurried phone calls, impatient waiting, and the signing of forms in triplicate. By late afternoon, however, they were standing back in Julian Croft's penthouse, this time with a third person in tow, a young tech specialist from the department's cyberforensics unit named Leo. Leo was everything Jack wasn't. He was young, energetic, and his eyes lit up with genuine excitement as he examined the high-tech safe. He wore a t-shirt with a line of code printed on it and carried a hard case full of electronics that looked more complex than the dashboard of a fighter jet. "Wow," Leo said, running a scanner over the safe's surface. "This is a custom job. Biometric fingerprint scanner, reinforced steel alloy, and a digital keypad with a rolling code algorithm. Croft wasn't messing around. "This thing is a fortress. Can you open it?" Jack asked, his patience already wearing thin. "Can a fish swim?" Leo grinned, plugging a tablet into a small port he'd located on the safe's frame. "It'll take a little time to brute force the encryption, but nothing is uncrackable. Just don't hold your breath." For the next hour, the only sounds in the vast, silent apartment were the soft tapping of Leo's fingers on his tablet and the low hum of his equipment. Jack paced the length of the room, while Miller stood with her arms crossed, watching Leo's screen as lines of code scrolled past at an impossible speed. The anticipation was a physical presence in the room, thick and heavy. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Leo's machine emitted a series of sharp beeps, followed by a solid, satisfying thunk as the safe's locking mechanism disengaged. "And we're in," Leo announced, wiping a bead of sweat from his forehead. "Try not to break it again, guys. My fingers are sore." Jack stepped forward and pulled the small, heavy door open. He and Miller peered inside. The immediate feeling was one of anticlimax. There were no stacks of cash, no weapon, no folders labeled top secret. Instead, the small, felt-lined compartment contained what looked like a memory box. It was far more personal and far more unsettling than they had imagined. Carefully, Miller began removing the items and placing them on a clean evidence sheet on the coffee table. There was a small stack of old, slightly faded photographs, tied together with a simple blue ribbon. There was a single dried and pressed daisy, a ticket stub for a movie called Summer's End, dated 20 years ago, and a delicate silver locket, tarnished with age. Jack picked up the stack of photos. They weren't professional portraits. They were candid shots, taken from a distance. A young woman with bright, laughing eyes and long, dark hair. Pictures of her studying in a library, walking across a college campus, sitting on a park bench with a friend. She was beautiful, but there was an obsessive, voyeuristic quality to the photos that made Jack's skin crawl. "This doesn't feel like a rich man's secret stash," Miller said quietly, holding the silver locket in her gloved palm. "It feels like a shrine." She carefully pried the locket open. Inside, there wasn't a picture. Instead, two tiny, intricate initials were engraved, EV. The last item in the safe was a thick, manila folder. Jack opened it. Inside were two documents. The first was a birth certificate. The second was a sealed legal document that looked like a trust fund agreement. Jack's eyes scanned the birth certificate, his gaze stopping at the name printed in official, block letters. Eliza Vance. The name hung in the air for a moment. Vance. The same as Croft's polished, professional, and overly dismissive COO. "Run that name, Miller," Jack said, his voice suddenly tight. "Now." Miller pulled out her department-issued phone, her fingers flying across the screen as she accessed the city records and police databases. Jack continued to stare at the photograph of the smiling young woman, a knot of dread forming in his stomach. Nothing about this case was what it seemed. A high-tech murder mystery had just taken a sharp turn into a dusty, hidden past. "Oh my God," Miller breathed, looking up from her phone, her face pale. "Jack, what is it?" "Eliza Vance. Born 24 years ago. Died 20 years ago, at the age of 19. Miller swallowed hard. She was a student at Veridia University. She was killed in a hit-and-run 2 blocks from her campus dorm. The driver was never found. The case went cold. And the connection?" Jack asked, though he already knew the answer. He could feel it, a cold certainty clicking into place like the tumblers of a lock. Miller's eyes met his. According to the file, her next of kin, the person who identified her body at the morgue, was her older brother, Elias Vance. The sterile, silent penthouse suddenly felt like a tomb, haunted by ghosts Jack was just beginning to see. The whole case had been turned on its head. Julian Croft, the tech billionaire, was secretly obsessed with his second-in-command sister, a sister who had died 2 decades ago in an unsolved crime. All the questions shifted, reforming into a new, terrifying picture. Was Croft responsible for Eliza's death? Was her accident no accident at all? And Elias Vance, had he known about this twisted obsession all along? His calm demeanor, his quick dismissal of the note, it all looked different now. It looked like the carefully constructed facade of a man hiding a 20-year-old wound. The cryptic note took on a new, horrifying meaning. This wasn't about business. This was about revenge. A shadow that had been waiting 2 decades to fall. Jack gathered the evidence, his movements sharp and precise. The fatigue he'd felt for days was gone, replaced by a cold, hard focus. "We're done here," he said to Miller. "Where are we going?" she asked, her voice still shaken. Back to Nexus Dynamics, Jack replied, his gaze as hard as granite. Mr. Vance and I are going to have another conversation. But this time, we won't be talking about business deals or quarterly reports. We're going to talk about his sister. The drive back to the financial district was tense and silent. Both Jack and Miller were lost in their own thoughts, the ghost of Eliza Vance riding with them in the unmarked sedan. The city blurred past the windows, but all Jack could see was the smiling face in the faded photographs. This was no longer just a case, it was a tragedy, 2 decades in the making. He's not going to want to talk to us, Miller said, breaking the silence as they pulled up to the gleaming tower of Nexus Dynamics. He doesn't have a choice, Jack replied, his jaw set. We're past the point of asking nicely. His professional mask is about to come off. They bypassed the front desk this time, flashing their badges and heading straight for the elevators with a grim sense of purpose. On the executive floor, Vance's secretary, a poised woman in her 50s, stood up from her desk to intercept them. I'm sorry, detectives, but Mr. Vance is on an important international call. He can't be disturbed. Jack walked right past her as if she were invisible. He can reschedule. He pushed open the heavy oak door to Vance's office without knocking. Elias Vance was sitting behind his desk, looking every bit the powerful executive, speaking in low, authoritative tones into a headset. He looked up, his eyes flashing with annoyance at the intrusion. He held up a finger, signaling for them to wait. Jack ignored it. He walked directly to the desk, took the photograph of Eliza Vance from his coat pocket, and placed it face up in the center of the polished mahogany, right next to Vance's keyboard. Vance stopped talking mid-sentence. His eyes dropped to the photograph. For a moment, all the air seemed to leave the room. The carefully constructed mask of the calm, composed so didn't just crack, it shattered. His face went pale, his jaw went slack, and a look of such profound raw grief filled his eyes that it was like watching a 20-year-old wound tear open. He fumbled to end his call, his hand trembling slightly. What is this? He whispered, his voice hoarse, unrecognizable from the smooth baritone of their previous meeting. That's our question for you, Jack said, his tone cold and flat. We found Julian Croft's hidden safe. We found his shrine to your sister, Elias. The photos he took. The locket. Everything. We know he was obsessed with her. Now, you're going to tell us what happened 20 years ago. Vance stared at his sister's smiling face, and something inside him broke. He slumped back in his expensive leather chair, all the power and authority draining out of him, leaving behind a tired, haunted man. He covered his face with his hands for a moment, and when he looked up again, his eyes were wet. You have no idea, he began, his voice cracking. None of you could possibly know. He took a shaky breath and started to talk, the words spilling out as if a dam had finally burst. We were kids. Meet Julian and our other friend, Mark. We were going to conquer the world. We started a small tech company in a garage, fueled by cheap pizza and big dreams. Julian was the genius, the visionary. I was the pragmatist. And Eliza, my little sister, she was our light. She was brilliant, funny, full of life. And Julian, he adored her. But it wasn't healthy. He saw her as something to be acquired, another prize. She liked him as a friend, but his intensity, it scared her. He paused, looking out the window at the city below, but seeing a different time entirely. The night she died, there was a party. Eliza had just gotten accepted into a prestigious grad school program. We were all celebrating, but Julian had been drinking. He tried to corner her, telling her they should move away together, that he'd take care of her. She turned him down, told him he was being crazy. They had a huge fight. She left the party in tears. Vance's voice dropped to a near whisper. Julian was enraged. He grabbed his car keys to go after her. I tried to stop him. I told him he was too drunk to drive, but he just pushed me away. The next time I saw him was 3 hours later, when he came back to my apartment, covered in mud, rambling that his car had been stolen. And an hour after that, the police were at my door. You suspected him from the beginning, Miller stated, her voice gentle. I didn't suspect, Vance said, his voice thick with self-loathing. I knew he was the one who hit her. But I had no proof. He had an alibi, that his car was stolen. His family had money, lawyers. I was a nobody with a dead sister. What could I do? You could have kept fighting, Jack said, his voice hard. Vance let out a bitter, hollow laugh. Fighting? With what? A week after Eliza's funeral, Julian came to me with a proposition. A devil's bargain. He said his guilt was eating him alive. He told me he would dedicate his life to making it right, not by confessing, but by giving me everything I could ever want. He poured his family's money into our little company. He made me his partner. He built Nexus Dynamics on a foundation of his guilt and my silence. He made me a king in a golden prison, forcing me to work alongside my sister's killer every single day for 20 years. So you finally snapped, Jack pushed. You killed him. You left the note. Vance looked Jack straight in the eye, and for the first time, Jack saw a flicker of the powerful man he had been moments before. No, he said, his voice firm. If I were going to kill him, I would have done it 20 years ago. My choice was made back then, detective. I chose the money. I chose the prison. I've lived with that shame every second of every day. But I did not kill him. I have no idea who did, or what that ridiculous note about a king means. Someone else knew our secret. Someone else decided it was time for the bill to come due. His denial felt sickeningly genuine. He was a man who had sold his soul, not one who had finally sought vengeance. He was broken, not liberated. Jack and Miller left him there, a shattered king sitting on a throne built of lies. As the elevator descended in silence, the gears of the investigation were grinding, shifting onto a new track. If he's telling the truth, Miller said, thinking out loud, then someone else from their past is our killer. Someone who knew the whole story. Jack stared at the polished brass doors, seeing his own tired reflection. Vance's story had given them the motive, the why of it all. But it had also introduced a new, unknown player. Vance mentioned a third friend, Jack said, the name coming back to him. The one from the garage days. Mark. We need to find out who Mark is, and where he's been for the last 20 years. The hunt for K was over. The hunt for Mark had just begun. The air in the homicide division felt different now. The sprawling, chaotic investigation had collapsed into a single, sharp point. Jack erased the whiteboard, wiping away the dozens of dead-end names and complex diagrams. In the clean, white space, he wrote one thing in bold, black letters: Markham Jennings. Elias Vance, now stripped of his secrets, had been reluctantly cooperative. A single, strained phone call was all it took to get the full name. Markham Jennings. The third friend. The ghost at the banquet. Okay, Jack said, turning to Miller, who was already seated at her computer, fingers poised over the keyboard. Let's find him. Run the name through everything you've got. DMV, IRS, credit bureaus, social media, the works. Let's see what this ghost has been up to for the last 20 years. Miller's typing was a quiet, staccato rhythm in the otherwise humming office. For the first few minutes, the search yielded promising results. They found a Markham Jennings enrolled at Veridia University 20 years ago, same age as Croft and Vance. A grainy photo from a student ID showed a young man with intense, dark eyes and a serious expression. Another photo, pulled from a digital archive of the university's newspaper, showed the three of them together, Julian, Elias, and Mark, grinning, arms slung over each other's shoulders, looking for all the world like three young kings ready to conquer their kingdom. But then, the trail went cold. He dropped out, Miller announced, her brow furrowed in concentration. 3 weeks after Eliza Vance's death. Just gone. No forwarding address. He never transferred to another school. Keep digging, Jack urged, pacing behind her chair. He couldn't have just vanished. Well, it looks like he did, Miller said a few minutes later, leaning back with a frustrated sigh. There are no credit card applications in his name. No tax returns. No property records after he sold a small house he inherited from his grandparents 19 years ago. His driver's license expired in 2006 and was never renewed. For all intents and purposes, Markham Jennings ceased to exist 20 years ago. A man doesn't just erase himself for no reason. He runs. He hides. Jack stared at the young, serious face on the screen. He knew, Jack said, the certainty settling in his gut. Vance made a deal with the devil. Jennings must have refused. He knew what Croft did, and he couldn't live with it. So he disappears for 2 decades, only to pop up now to kill Croft and leave a cryptic note? Miller countered. It's a long time to hold a grudge. For some people, justice doesn't have an expiration date, Jack said grimly. He leaned closer to Miller's screen. You said you found his university records. What was his major? Let's see. Miller clicked through a few screens. Here it is. Bachelor of Arts, History. His specialization was, get this, medieval European monarchies and legal systems. Jack felt a jolt, a spark of connection. Kings. Justice. Reckoning. It was all starting to fit. Is there anything else in that file? Papers he wrote. Notes from professors. It's mostly transcripts and enrollment forms, Miller said, scrolling. Wait, here's something. A flag for an academic probation hearing, dated the week he withdrew from the university. She opened the attached file. It was a scanned copy of a professor's handwritten notes. His faculty advisor was concerned. Mark had missed all his classes since Eliza's death. The notes say he was distraught and exhibiting obsessive ideations regarding concepts of absolute justice. She leaned closer, reading the spidery handwriting. The professor writes, Mr. Jennings was rambling. He spoke of how even kings must face a reckoning for their sins. He quoted an old text, saying something I wrote down here. Miller squinted. A shadow of truth will always fall, no matter how long the day or how bright the sun. Jack and Miller looked at each other. The silence in the office was electric. It wasn't just a similar theme, it was the origin. The killer's note wasn't a random line of poetry. It was a philosophy. It was Markham Jennings' personal creed, born from the trauma of his friend's death. They had found their man. The only problem was, he was a phantom. He's been living off the grid, Jack stated. Working for cash, staying out of the system. We'll never find him through a database. He felt the familiar frustration of a digital dead end. You could have all the technology in the world, but it was useless against a man who refused to participate in the modern world. His eyes went back to the academic file on the screen. He looked at the name of the concerned faculty advisor who had taken the notes. Professor Alastair Finch. This Professor Finch. Is he still at the university? Miller's fingers flew across the keyboard again. No. Professor Finch retired about 8 years ago. But he still has a listed address. A quiet little suburb about an hour north of the city. Still in the area. A new path had opened up. A path not of fiber optics and data streams, but of memory and human connection. A man like Jennings, Jack thought aloud. A man obsessed with history, a man who felt the world had failed him. If he was going to say goodbye to his old life, who might he have confided in? Not the friend who sold his silence. Maybe the old history professor who actually listened. He grabbed his coat, a renewed sense of purpose surging through him. We've been hunting for a ghost in a machine, Miller. It's time we talked to someone who knew him when he was still a man. Get the address. We're paying Professor Finch a visit. The hour-long drive north was a journey through time. The dense, vertical maze of Veridia City's downtown, with its reflected neon and impatient traffic, gradually gave way to the sprawling, repetitive geometry of the suburbs. Soon, those two bled into quieter roads flanked by old-growth trees, their autumn leaves forming a canopy of gold and rust over the asphalt. It felt like they were leaving the present behind, driving deeper into the past where the answers to this case were buried. Professor Alastair Finch lived in a modest, ivy-covered brick house on a street where all the lawns were perfectly manicured. When he answered the door, he looked exactly as Jack had pictured. An older man with a gentle, inquisitive face, a shock of white hair, and wearing a worn tweed jacket over a simple cardigan. His home smelled of old books, pipe tobacco, and lemon tea. Books weren't just on shelves, they were in neat stacks on floors, tables, and chairs, a lifetime of knowledge turned into architecture. Detectives, he said, his voice soft but clear, ushering them into his study. I must admit, this is a first for me. Please, sit. Jack bypassed the pleasantries. He knew their time was valuable. He showed the professor the photograph of the three young men, Croft, Vance, and Jennings. Finch took the photo, put on a pair of reading glasses, and a sad, knowing smile touched his lips. Ah yes, he said, his gaze lingering on one face in particular. The triumvirate, I used to call them. They were all in my History of Western Law seminar. Mr. Croft was ambitious, Mr. Vance was sharp, but Markham. He tapped the glass over Jennings' face. Markham was different. He didn't just study history, he felt it. He had a profound, almost painful sense of justice. A brilliant mind. We need to talk to you about him, Professor, Miller said gently. Specifically, about the time after Eliza Vance's death. The professor's smile faded. He placed the photo on his desk and looked at them, his eyes clouded with a decades-old memory. That was when the light went out in him, he said quietly. I remember it vividly. The boy who walked into my office for that academic hearing was not the same one I had known. He was a ghost. Hollowed out by grief and by a rage so cold it was terrifying. Finch recounted the meeting, his memory for detail astonishing. He described Mark's disillusionment, his certainty that Julian Croft was the driver, and his disgust when he realized that Elias Vance had chosen silence and money over his own sister. He saw it in historical terms, Finch explained. To him, Croft was a modern-day king, believing himself above the laws that governed common men. And Vance was the courtier who enabled him. The system, he said, was designed to protect its kings. So it was up to history, up to the individual, to deliver true justice. The note we found at the crime scene said, "Where the silent king watches, the shadow will fall," Jack said, watching the professor's reaction closely. Finch nodded slowly, a deep sadness in his eyes. That was his thesis, in a way. The central theme of a paper he was writing on the fall of monarchies. He believed that no matter how powerful a ruler was, their misdeeds created a shadow. And eventually, inevitably, that shadow would grow long enough to consume them. It might take a day, or it might take a generation, but the shadow always falls. The connection was undeniable, a straight, unbroken line from a troubled student's essay to a billionaire's murder scene. "Professor," Jack leaned forward, his voice low. "Markham Jennings has been missing for 20 years. We believe he killed Julian Croft. We need to find him. Did you ever see him again after that meeting? Did he ever say where he was going?" Alistair Finch was silent for a long moment, looking down at his clasped, wrinkled hands. He seemed to be weighing an old promise against a new reality. "He came to my home," he finally confessed. "About a week after he officially withdrew from the university. He looked calmer, resigned. He told me he was divorcing himself from a world he no longer recognized, a world without honor. He said he was going away. Away where?" Miller pressed. He was always fascinated by self-sufficient communities, by people who lived according to their own codes, outside the system. He spoke of a place in the foothills of the Grey Spire Mountains, a remote settlement for people who wanted to live off the grid. He found the name of the place deeply symbolic. The professor looked up, his gaze meeting Jack's. He told me he was going to a place called Sovereign's Rest. The name landed with the weight of a stone. A remote community in the mountains. A place for a man to wait. To plan. As they stood to leave, Finch offered one last, chilling memory. When he was at the door, I asked him if he was running away. He turned and looked at me, and his eyes were so clear, so calm. He said, "No, Professor. I'm not running. I'm waiting. In history, timing is everything. You have to wait for the right moment, for the shadow to be at its longest, before it can fall." Then he thanked me for the books, and he was gone. Back in the car, the quiet of the suburbs felt different, more ominous. The hunt for a ghost was over. They weren't chasing a memory anymore. They were chasing a man. A patient, methodical man who had been waiting 20 years for his moment. Jack started the car, the engine a low growl in the stillness. He looked at the map on his phone, zooming out from the city to the vast, green expanse of the mountains to the west. Sovereign's Rest. "He's been up there all this time," Miller said, her voice a mix of awe and dread. "Just waiting." "His wait is over," Jack said, putting the car in gear and pulling away from the curb. "Let's go find our King Slayer." Before leaving the city, procedure dictated they brief their captain. Captain Eva Rostova, a woman who had seen more than her share of strange cases, listened intently in her glass-walled office, her expression unreadable. She studied the photos of Croft, Eliza, and the young Markham Jennings laid out on her desk. "So you're telling me this 20-year-old hit-and-run is the motive for one of the highest-profile murders this city has seen in a decade?" she asked, her voice a low rasp. "All the evidence points that way, Captain," Callahan confirmed. "The killer has been living off-grid for 2 decades in a place called Sovereign's Rest. We're heading there now. A remote community of anti-government types and who knows what else," Rostova mused, tapping a pen on her desk. "Do you want me to call the county sheriff? Arrange for local backup?" Callahan and Miller exchanged a look. "No, ma'am," Miller said. "We go in with a convoy, and he'll be gone before we get within 10 miles. He's a ghost. We have to approach this quietly. Just the 2 of us for now. If we need backup, we'll find a way to call it in." Rostova studied them for a long moment, then nodded. "All right. But you check in every hour once you're in range. I don't care if you have anything to report. I want to know you're okay. Go find your ghost, Callahan." The journey into the Grey Spire Mountains was like driving backwards through civilization. The highways gave way to 2-lane country roads, which in turn narrowed into winding asphalt paths with no shoulder and no center line. Finally, following the professor's old directions, they turned onto an unmarked dirt road that was little more than a set of tire tracks disappearing into a dense forest. Their city sedan complained, bumping and scraping over rocks and ruts. The trees grew closer, their branches forming a dense canopy that cast the road in perpetual twilight. As they climbed higher, Jack's phone chirped a final time and then displayed the dreaded "no service" message. They were cut off. Alone. After another 20 minutes of careful driving, the forest opened up into a wide, secluded valley. This was Sovereign's Rest. It wasn't a compound, but a scattered collection of mismatched dwellings. There were sturdy log cabins with smoke curling from stone chimneys, geodesic domes with solar panels glinting in the sun, and a few rugged yurts. Patches of cleared land held large vegetable gardens, and the air smelled of wood smoke and pine. It was quiet, the only sounds being the wind in the trees and the distant clang of a blacksmith's hammer. As their out-of-place vehicle rolled slowly into the valley, people stopped what they were doing. A man chopping wood rested his axe, watching them pass. A woman tending her garden stood up, shielding her eyes, her expression wary. No one waved. No one smiled. It was the universal look of a closed community assessing a threat. They parked near a central clearing where a large fire pit sat cold. As they got out, a woman emerged from the largest of the cabins. She was tall and weathered, with graying hair tied back in a practical braid and eyes the color of slate. She wasn't holding a weapon, but she moved with a kind of confidence that suggested she was never far from one. "You're a long way from the city," she said, her voice even and direct. It wasn't a question. Jack pulled out his badge. "Detective Callahan, VCPD. This is Detective Miller. We're looking for someone." The woman looked at the badge, then back at Jack, entirely unimpressed. "Badges don't mean much up here. This is private land. We take care of our own problems. What do you want?" "We're looking for a man named Markham Jennings," Jack said, holding out the old university photograph. "He would be in his early 40s now. We have reason to believe he came here a long time ago." The woman studied the photo, her expression unreadable. She looked at the intense, dark-eyed young man in the picture for a long time before handing it back. "We have a mark here," she said. "He keeps to himself. Been here since before I was. What business does the city police have with him?" "Our business is murder," Miller said, her tone firm but not aggressive. "A man named Julian Croft was killed in Veridia City a few days ago. We believe your mark is connected to it." The woman, who they now assumed was the community's unofficial leader, crossed her arms, her gaze shifting from Miller to Callahan, weighing them up. "Mark is a quiet man. Reads his books. Tends his garden. He's not a killer. He was once," Jack said. "A long time ago. Now we need to hear his side of the story. Obstructing a homicide investigation is a serious crime, no matter how far you are from the city." The woman held his gaze, a silent battle of wills playing out in the mountain air. Finally, she gave a slow, deliberate nod, as if she'd come to a difficult conclusion. She had to protect her community, and a murder investigation was a fire she did not want spreading through her valley. "I won't stand in your way," she said. "But I'm telling you, be careful. The man you're looking for isn't the boy in that picture. 20 years in these mountains, it changes a person. He lives by his own code now." She turned and pointed towards a high ridge that overlooked the entire valley, a natural watchtower. Nestled among the tall pines was a small, solitary cabin, a thin plume of smoke rising from its chimney. "He built that place himself, piece by piece," the woman said. "Likes the solitude. Likes to keep an eye on things." Jack and Miller followed her gaze up to the isolated dwelling. A man who likes to watch. A silent king in his own castle. Their 20-year-old ghost was finally in their sights. The long, patient wait was over for both of them. The final confrontation was just a short, steep climb away. The path up to the cabin was steep and covered in loose shale, forcing them to watch their footing. It was a clear tactical advantage for the cabin's resident. No one could approach without making noise, without being exposed. With every step, Jack felt they were moving further into another man's world, a kingdom of solitude and long-held grudges. The air grew thinner, cooler. Below them, the small settlement of Sovereign's Rest looked like a collection of children's toys. They emerged from the tree lean into a small, neat clearing. The cabin was a testament to patience and skill, built from hand-hewn logs with a sturdy stone chimney. To the side, a terraced garden was meticulously tended, and firewood was stacked in a perfect, high wall. This was the home of a deliberate, orderly man. And there he was, sitting on the front porch in a simple handmade wooden chair, a book resting open in his lap. He wasn't the wild mountain man they might have expected. He was lean and weathered, his dark hair now streaked with gray and tied back. His face was lined from the sun and the years, but his eyes were the same. The same intense, intelligent, and serious eyes from the university photograph. He watched them approach, his expression not of surprise or fear, but of calm, quiet finality. He had been waiting. "I was wondering when you'd arrive, detectives," he said, his voice a low, steady baritone, and used to regular conversation but clear nonetheless. He didn't get up. He simply closed his book, marking his page with a finger. "Markham Jennings," Callahan said, his own voice sounding loud in the mountain stillness. They stopped at the foot of the porch steps, standing on his ground. "We're here to talk about the murder of Julian Croft." A slow, sad smile touched Mark's lips. "Murder is a city word, detective. A legal term for a system that failed. I prefer to think of it as a correction. A balancing of the historical record." There was no denial, no shock, just a calm, chilling statement of fact. This wasn't an interrogation, it was a debriefing. "You left a note," Miller stated, her hand resting near her service weapon. "A thesis," Mark corrected gently. Julian was the silent king in his glass tower, watching over the city, his crime buried and forgotten. He was a man who believed his wealth made him infallible, untouchable. But every action creates a consequence. Every king casts a shadow. I was his shadow. The one he created 20 years ago. It was only a matter of time before it fell on him. "How did you get in?" Jack asked, the practical question cutting through the philosophical haze. "The Pinnacle has some of the best security in the country." Mark looked at him, a flicker of pride in his eyes. Julian's arrogance was always his greatest weakness. The security system in that building is state-of-the-art, but the private elevator, the one that went to his penthouse, the core programming for its security protocol was based on a system we designed together, in a garage when we were 19. He kept it for sentimental reasons. He called it his ghost key. He never imagined that the ghost it was named for would one day come back to use it. He had confessed, calmly, rationally, without a hint of remorse. He saw himself not as a killer, but as an instrument of justice, an avenging angel of history who had finally brought a corrupt monarch to his end. It was clean. It was logical. It was, in his mind, righteous. Jack felt a strange sense of closure mingling with the cold reality of the arrest he was about to make. There was just one last piece, one final detail to lock into place. "The appointment," Jack said. "Croft had you in his calendar. 8:30 p.m. An appointment with K. King, I assume. Your way of announcing your arrival." He expected a nod, a final, arrogant confirmation of his meticulous planning. Instead, for the first time, Markham Jennings' calm facade broke. A genuine look of confusion crossed his face. He leaned forward slightly, his brow furrowed. "Appointment?" he asked, the words sounding foreign. "I made no appointment. My visit was unannounced. My brand of justice requires no invitation." He was sitting by the window, a drink in his hand, when I entered. He never even saw me coming. Jack and Miller stared at him, then at each other. The air on the mountaintop suddenly felt much colder. Mark's confusion was real. He was their killer. He had just given them a full, detailed confession. But he hadn't made that appointment. He wasn't the K in Julian Croft's calendar. The clean, logical line of their investigation suddenly fractured. They had their killer, the man who had waited 20 years to deliver a fatal judgment. But the chilling truth was now settling upon them. Someone else was supposed to be there that night. Someone else was involved. "Then who?" Miller asked, her voice barely a whisper. "Is K?" Markham Jennings simply shook his head, his own certainty now rattled by this new, unknown variable. They had climbed the mountain to find a ghost, and they had. But now they were faced with a second one, a new phantom who had just stepped out of the shadows and onto the board. They had found their killer, but their case, they realized with a growing sense of dread, was far from over. The air on the mountain ridge was thin and cold. In the moments after the confession, a strange, profound silence settled over the three of them. They had their killer. The mystery, it seemed, was solved. And yet, the unexpected revelation of K had fractured their certainty, leaving a void of unnerving questions. Jack pulled out his handcuffs, the metallic click of the ratchet echoing unnaturally in the wilderness. "Markham Jennings," he said, his voice formal, procedural. "You are under arrest for the murder of Julian Croft." Mark didn't resist. He stood slowly, placing his book carefully on the chair, and turned, offering his wrists. There was no fear in his eyes, no anger. There was only a quiet, philosophical acceptance. His part of the story was over. The justice he had set in motion 20 years ago had been delivered, and this was the inevitable epilogue. The walk back down the mountain was slow and tense. Mark, cuffed in front, navigated the treacherous path with a familiar ease, a prisoner in his own kingdom. This other person, K, Miller said, walking beside him. You have no idea who it could be? Someone else from your past. Mark considered this for a moment, his gaze fixed on the trail. The past I shared with Julian died with Eliza, he said, his voice even. I haven't followed his life. I erased him from my world until the day I decided to erase him from this one. But a man like Julian, a king who builds his empire on a crime, his reign would have been filled with secrets. It doesn't surprise me that another shadow was stirring. You build a throne on a lie, you should expect more than one ghost to come haunt it. His words were cryptic, but rang with a certain truth. Croft's life was a web of secrets, and they had only tugged on a single thread. When they reached the valley floor, the residents of Sovereign's Rest were gathered in the clearing, watching. They didn't approach. They didn't shout. They simply stood, a silent, somber audience, as Abigail, their leader, watched Mark being placed in the back of the detective's sedan. It was a quiet, respectful farewell to a man they knew as a neighbor, now revealed to be something else entirely. The long drive back to Veridia City was a surreal experience. For 2 hours, their confessed killer sat silently in the back seat, staring out the window as the wild mountains dissolved back into manicured suburbs, and finally, into the hard electric pulse of the city. For Jack and Miller, it was a drive filled with a jarring mix of victory and profound unease. The district attorney is going to love us, Miller said, breaking the long silence. A full confession from a killer they thought was a ghost. It's the biggest case of the year, gift-wrapped. And what do we tell him about Kay? Jack countered, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. That there was another potential suspect, someone who had an appointment with the victim at the time of death, and we have no idea who it is? The DA will want to close the book. He'll call Kay a loose end, irrelevant now that they have their man. It's not irrelevant, Miller insisted. What if Kay was there to kill him too? What if Mark just got there first? Or what if Kay was a witness? Or something else entirely? Back at the precinct, the atmosphere was one of stunned celebration. News of the arrest had already spread. But Captain Rostova saw the exhaustion and uncertainty in their eyes as they explained the bizarre wrinkle in the case. Markham Jennings was processed and placed in an interrogation room, where he sat, cooperative but silent, requesting no lawyer and offering no more words. His story was told. For Jack and Miller, however, it felt like they were back at square one. By midnight, the station had quieted down. They stood before the whiteboard again. In the center, Markham Jennings, confessed killer, was written. But to the side, a larger, more troubling question mark loomed. Mark was the past, Jack said, rubbing his tired face. He was a ghost seeking old justice. Kay is the present. Someone in Croft's current life. Let's go back to the 24 hours before the murder. Forget the history. What was Croft doing right before he died? Miller, running on pure adrenaline and caffeine, sat down at her terminal. I'll pull his financials again, she said. His corporate accounts are a maze, but maybe a fresh look will turn up something. For an hour, the only sound was the quiet, determined clicking of her keyboard. She meticulously traced the flow of money in and out of Croft's labyrinth of shell corporations and holding companies. Suddenly, she stopped. Jack, she said, her voice tight. Come look at this. On the screen was a transaction record. It was dated the morning of the murder. A wire transfer for $10 million, sent from a subsidiary account of Nexus Dynamics. That wasn't the shocking part. It was sent to a private wealth management firm, a holding company called EV Capital, Miller explained, her fingers flying as she pulled up more information. On the surface, it's anonymous. But the incorporation papers were filed 5 years ago. I'm running the digital signature of the attorney who filed them. A new screen popped up. The firm is a ghost, but it's secretly owned, controlled by one person. She turned to look at Jack, her face a mask of disbelief. The sole proprietor of EV Capital is Elias Vance. Jack stared at the screen. The letters EV suddenly burned with significance. Eliza Vance. Elias Vance, Jack said slowly, the pieces clicking into a new, terrible configuration. The man in the golden prison. The man who claimed he got nothing but a guilty conscience. On the day he was murdered, Julian Croft had paid his partner, the brother of the woman he'd killed, $10 million. This wasn't the story of a victim who had made a deal with the devil. This was something else. Blackmail. Hush money. A final, desperate payment. The identity of Kay was still a mystery, but they now knew who they needed to talk to again. The shadow over the city had just gotten a whole lot darker. There is a moment in every complex investigation when the pieces, once scattered and chaotic, begin to snap into place with a sudden, violent clarity. For Jack Callahan and Maria Miller, that moment arrived under the harsh fluorescent lights of their office, staring at a screen that tied Julian Croft's murder to a $10 million payment to his seemingly loyal partner, Elias Vance. His golden prison, Jack muttered, a cynical edge to his voice. Turns out it had a price tag. We go now, Miller said, already grabbing her coat. There was no need for discussion. A revelation this significant couldn't wait for morning. It was a secret that could evaporate with the dawn, a witness who could disappear. Elias Vance lived in a sleek, modernist house in the city's wealthiest district, a place of sharp angles, vast glass walls, and manicured gardens hidden behind high stone fences. It wasn't a home, it was a statement. When they rang the bell long past midnight, the man who answered the door was not the grieving colleague or the haunted brother. He was an angry cornered tycoon, dressed in silk pajamas and a look of pure fury. This is harassment, he hissed, blocking the doorway. It's the middle of the night. I've told you everything I know. Get off my property. Jack didn't flinch. We're not here to talk about your sister, Elias, he said, his voice as cold and hard as the steel of the doorframe. We're here to talk about EV Capital and a $10 million payment you received from Julian Croft on the morning he died. The name of the shell company hit Vance like a physical blow. All the anger and indignation vanished from his face, replaced by a sudden, stark terror. His carefully maintained composure crumbled into dust. He seemed to shrink in the doorway, the fight draining out of him completely. The game was up, and he knew it. Defeated, he stepped back, gesturing them into a living room that looked more like an art gallery than a place of comfort. He sank into a low-slung Italian leather sofa, the picture of a broken man. You have to understand, he began, his voice a hoarse whisper. 20 years. For 20 years, I lived with it. I took his money. I helped him build an empire on top of my sister's grave. I told myself it was the only choice I had. And then you decided you wanted more than just a salary, Miller said, her voice devoid of sympathy. You decided you wanted it all. Vance looked up, his eyes filled with a fresh, raw pain. It wasn't just about the money, he insisted. About 6 months ago, I was conducting a deep-level data transfer from our old company servers. I found a corrupted file hidden in an encrypted partition. It took our best techs weeks to recover it. It was an audio file. He swallowed hard. It was Julian, recorded about a year after Eliza's death. He was drunk, rambling, and confessing. He talked about the fight, about getting in the car, about the sound it made when he hit her. He detailed everything. A 20-year-old confession, buried in the ones and zeros of our own server. The pieces snapped into place. The motive. The leverage. You blackmailed him, Jack stated. I called it a severance, Vance corrected, a spark of his old bitterness returning. It was my price for 2 decades of silence. $10 million, and he would sign over his controlling shares in Nexus Dynamics to me. I would finally have the company, and he would be free of his ghost. He could retire, disappear. He agreed. A final, crucial piece of the puzzle slid into Jack's mind. The appointment, he said. 8:30 p.m., K. Vance let out a hollow, bitter laugh. K is for keeper, he said, the words dripping with self-loathing. That's what he called me, in private. The keeper of his dirty secret. The meeting was for the final exchange. He would sign the last of the transfer documents, and I would give him the original audio file to destroy. So you were on your way to the penthouse that night, Miller pressed. Yes, Vance admitted. I was running late. There was a traffic snarl downtown. By the time I got to the pinnacle, I saw the first patrol cars pulling up. I saw the lights. I knew something was wrong. I turned around and drove away. I've been sitting here, waiting for this knock on my door ever since. His story was clean. It was ugly, and it was born of greed and decades of resentment, but it fit every remaining fact of the case. It explained the money. It explained the mysterious appointment. It explained who Kay was. Elias Vance wasn't the killer. He was the blackmailer who had almost walked into the execution of his mark. We're going to need that audio file, Elias, Jack said, his voice leaving no room for argument. Vance nodded, resigned. He walked over to a high-tech wall unit, his fingers tapping on a tablet. After a few moments of silent data transfer, he held out a small, sleek thumb drive. Here it is, he said. The truth. For whatever it's worth now. Jack took the drive. It was cool and smooth in his hand, a tiny, inert object that contained the confession of a dead man and the final, rotten truth at the heart of their case. They had found their killer on a mountaintop, a man seeking a pure, historical form of justice. And now, in a glass mansion in the heart of the city, they had found the rest of the story, a grimy modern tale of blackmail, greed, and secrets. The case of the cryptic note was finally closed. The only thing left to do was to listen to the ghost. The silence in the soundproofed interrogation viewing room was absolute. On the other side of the one-way glass, Markham Jennings sat perfectly still, a man at peace with his choices. In the viewing room, however, the atmosphere was electric with tension. Callahan, Miller, and Captain Rostova were gathered around a speaker connected to Miller's laptop. On the screen was a simple audio player, the thumb drive from Elias Vance plugged into its side. "This is the confession of Julian Croft," Callahan said, his voice low. "Recorded 20 years ago. According to Vance, this is the truth he used for his blackmail." He looked at the captain, who gave a sharp nod. "Play it." Miller clicked the mouse. A faint hiss of static filled the room, the sound of old, corrupted data brought back to life. Then, a voice emerged from the speaker. It was unmistakably a younger Julian Croft, full of the arrogance and swagger they'd heard about, but it was cracked, frayed by alcohol and something much darker. "She's gone," the voice slurred, the sound of a whiskey glass clinking against a table punctuating the sentence. "Just gone. I told her I'd take care of her. She just laughed at me." There was a pause, a ragged, shuddering breath. "I just wanted to talk to her, to make her see. The car, it was so fast. I didn't even see her step out. Just a sound. I drove away. I just drove and drove. What have I done? Oh God, what have I done?" The recording ended in a sound of choked sobbing before cutting out abruptly. The three officers sat in stunned silence. It was raw, horrifying, and utterly convincing. It was the ghost in the machine, confessing to the crime that had set everything in motion. "That's it," Captain Rostova said, her voice grim. "That's the whole story. Vance's blackmail, Jennings' revenge, it all lines up." The legal gears began to turn with ruthless efficiency. The district attorney's office was ecstatic. They had the killer, Markham Jennings, who had already confessed. Now, they had the victim's own voice confirming the 20-year-old motive. Elias Vance, through his high-priced lawyers, quickly negotiated a deal. He would provide his full testimony about the blackmail and the confession file in exchange for immunity. The media ignited with the story, the vigilante killer, the corrupt billionaire, and the brother who had kept the terrible secret for 2 decades. The case of the cryptic note was, for all intents and purposes, considered closed. But for Detective Miller, something felt off. It was too neat, too perfect. Vance, the man who had lied to them so calmly before, had delivered the final, perfect piece of evidence that not only cemented the case against Jennings, but also conveniently explained his own $10 million windfall. That evening, long after the press conferences had ended and the station had emptied out, she sat at her desk, staring at the audio file's waveform on her screen. "What are you doing?" Jack asked, packing his briefcase. "Case is closed, Miller. We won." "I know," she said, chewing on her lip. "But this file..." Vance said their techs recovered it from a corrupted archive. Data recovery is messy. There should be more artifacts, glitches. This sounds almost too clean. She looked up at him, a determined glint in her eye. "I have a friend from my academy days, Sarah. She's a specialist in audio authentication, works on federal cases. I want to send this to her. Off the record. Just to be sure." Jack sighed. He was a man who believed in confessions and evidence you could hold. "Miller, we have the killer in a cell and the victim's confession on a drive. Don't go looking for problems that aren't there." But he saw the look on her face and knew it was pointless to argue. "Fine. But do it quietly. The DA would have our heads if he thought we were questioning the evidence that just closed his biggest case." 2 days passed. The city began to move on. Elias Vance was announced as the new CEO of Nexus Dynamics, his takeover complete. Markham Jennings sat in a federal holding cell, awaiting a trial that was a mere formality. Then, Miller's personal cell phone rang. It was Sarah. "Hey, I looked at that audio file you sent me," Sarah said, her voice professional but with an undercurrent of excitement. "And is it legitimate?" Miller asked, holding her breath. "Oh, it's a masterpiece," Sarah replied. Miller's heart sank. "A true work of art." "So it's real," Miller said, disappointed. "No," Sarah said quickly. "That's what I'm telling you. It's not real. It's the most sophisticated deepfake I've ever analyzed. The vocal inflections, the breathing patterns, the emotional cues, they're cloned perfectly from Croft's public speeches and interviews. The background static, the sound of the glass, it's all layered in. Someone didn't recover this file, Maria. Someone composed it. It's a fabrication. Miller felt the floor drop out from beneath her. Every fact they had built the end of their case on, every piece of the neat narrative, was a lie. The confession was fake. Vance's story of finding it was a lie. His entire blackmail scheme was based on a manufactured piece of evidence. She hung up the phone, her hands shaking. She looked over at Jack, who was finishing up his final report on the now-closed case. "Jack," she said, her voice trembling with the enormity of what she was about to say. "That audio file. Croft's confession. What about it?" he asked, not looking up. "It's a fake. A perfect, brilliant fake. Elias Vance didn't find a confession. He created one." Jack stopped typing. He slowly looked up at her, the full, terrifying implications washing over his face. They had arrested a killer, yes. But the man who had so graciously handed them the truth, the man who now controlled a billion-dollar empire, was not a greedy opportunist. He was a masterful, manipulative liar. And their case wasn't closed. It had just been blown wide open. Jack Callahan felt like he'd been punched in the gut. He stared at Miller, the echo of her words, "It's a fake," reverberating in the quiet squad room. For a fleeting moment, the case had been a thing of perfect, tragic symmetry. A crime, a long wait, and a final bloody act of justice. Now, that symmetry was shattered, revealing a twisted, ugly reality beneath. The foundation of their entire case was a lie. "He played us," Jack said, the words coming out in a low, dangerous growl. "All of us. The department, the DA, the whole city. That story about the Golden Prison, it wasn't a confession. It was a performance. And we gave him a standing ovation," Miller added bitterly. She was already pacing, the shock turning into a cold, analytical fury. "Okay, let's break it down. Why? Why create a fake confession when he already knew Croft was guilty?" "Because knowing isn't the same as proving," Jack reasoned, his mind racing to catch up to the new reality. Vance had no tangible proof. For 20 years, it was his word against a dead man's. So he manufactured the proof himself. He created the perfect weapon to force Croft's hand. It was the ultimate bluff, and Croft, knowing he was guilty, had no choice but to fold. The sheer audacity of it was breathtaking. Elias Vance wasn't a passive victim who stumbled upon an opportunity. He was a predator who had spent months, maybe years, forging the perfect tool to bring down his partner and seize an empire. This changed everything. They went to Captain Rostova. They closed the door to her office, and in hushed, urgent tones, laid out the new, unbelievable truth. Rostova, a veteran of 1,000 departmental battles, listened without interruption, her face becoming a thundercloud. "So you're telling me," she said when they finished, "that our star witness in the city's biggest murder case is a manipulative fraud who fabricated his key evidence, and your proof of this comes from an unofficial, inadmissible analysis from a friend?" She swore under her breath. "We can't use this. If we go to the DA now, he'll bury us. Vance walks, the case against Jennings is compromised, and this department becomes a laughingstock. So we let Vance get away with it?" Miller challenged. "No," Rostova said, her eyes hardening. "You don't. You find me admissible proof. You investigate Elias Vance quietly. Off the books. As far as the world is concerned, the Croft case is closed. But the two of you, you go find me the truth. Find me the artist who painted this masterpiece for Vance." Their first stop was the Federal Detention Center. Markham Jennings was in a sterile, featureless interview room, looking smaller and paler than he had on his mountain, but just as calm. "We have some more questions about Elias Vance," Callahan began, deciding on a probing, indirect approach. Mark looked at him, a flicker of disinterest in his eyes. "Elias is a footnote. A coward who chose gold over blood. He is not relevant." "Maybe we misjudged him," Miller said, leaning forward. "We saw him as a victim, same as you. But I want you to think back, Mark, to the days right after Eliza's death. You were all reeling. What was Elias really like? Not what you thought then, but what you see now, looking back." Mark was silent for a long time, the question forcing him to turn his historian's gaze inward, to re-examine his own memories. "He was quiet," Mark said slowly. "I saw it as the quiet of grief. But it wasn't. It was the quiet of calculation. He was watching everything." He looked up, his eyes locking with Callahan's, a forgotten detail suddenly surfacing. "The alibi," Mark whispered, the memory hitting him with the force of a physical blow. Croft's alibi, that his car was stolen from the party. We were all in a panic. Julian was falling apart. But Elias, he was the one who pulled him aside. He was the one who told Julian exactly what to say. He fed him the story. I thought he was trying to protect his friend from a drunk driving charge, not a murder. I saw it as a desperate act of friendship. And now, Jack pressed. Now I see it was his first move in a 20-year chess game, Mark concluded, his voice filled with a new, chilling understanding. He wasn't protecting Julian. He was shackling him. He created a secret that only the two of them shared. He wasn't the keeper of Croft's secret. He was its architect. This new perspective changed the entire dynamic of the past. Elias Vance hadn't been a victim trapped in a deal. He had been a co-conspirator who had been leveraging his position from the very first day. Armed with this chilling insight, Miller returned to her desk with a renewed and specific purpose. Creating a deepfake of that quality wasn't cheap, and it wasn't something you paid for with a company credit card. It required secrecy and specialized, expensive talent. She began a forensic audit of Vance's personal and hidden corporate finances, a deep dive into the shadow economy where the wealthy hide their secrets. 4 hours, she chased encrypted transactions and offshore accounts. Then, she found it. A series of 6 large, untraceable wire transfers, made over the past 8 months. They were sent to a boutique firm based in Zurich, Switzerland. The firm's name was innocuous, Aletheia Digital Solutions. What does Aletheia mean? Jack asked, looking over her shoulder. It's the Greek word for truth, Miller said, a grim smile on her face. Their public-facing business is data security and brand management for high-net-worth individuals. But I dug into their dark web footprint. Their specialty, the service they don't advertise, is digital narrative reconstruction. Reconstruction. Creating, altering, and faking digital histories, photos, and audio files, all with perfect, untraceable authenticity, she explained. They're the best ghostwriters in the world. Vance didn't just find a random techie. He hired the best liars money could buy. She pointed to the final transaction, dated just 1 week before Croft's murder. This was the final payment, she said. Jack stared at the screen. The thread. They finally had a real, tangible thread they could pull. It was buried overseas, protected by layers of international privacy laws, but it was there. The case wasn't just about a cryptic note and a mountain recluse anymore. It was about a corporate titan, a Swiss firm of digital ghosts, and a lie so perfect it had almost buried the truth forever. I think, Miller said, looking at Jack, we just found the artists who painted Vance's masterpiece. The discovery of Aletheia Digital Solutions felt like a victory, but it was a victory viewed from the wrong side of a locked, bomb-proof door. In Captain Rostova's office, the three of them stared at the information on Miller's tablet, a tangible lead that was a continent away and protected by a legal system designed to repel outside inquiries. Zurich, Rostova said, leaning back in her chair and steepling her fingers. You couldn't have picked a more difficult place to investigate if you tried. Swiss corporate privacy laws are no joke. We send an official request from the VCPD, and they'll laugh before they shred it. So we're stuck, Callahan said, the frustration evident in his voice. We know Vance is a liar. We know who he likely paid to create his lie. But we can't prove it. Official channels are a dead end, Rostova agreed, which means we need an unofficial one. She fell silent, her gaze distant as she considered her options. Making an unofficial inquiry at this level was risky. It meant calling in favors that might never be returned, putting her own reputation and career on the line for a case that was, on paper, already closed. After a long moment, she made her decision. I have a contact, she said, her voice low and serious. Agent Thorne, FBI legal attaché, works out of their International Financial Crimes Division. We came up together at Quantico. He owes me one. She picked up her secure desk phone. This conversation does not leave this room. As far as anyone is concerned, the two of you are finishing up paperwork on the Jennings confession. The call to Agent Thorne was a masterful exercise in professional doublespeak. Rostova never mentioned the deepfake, the murder, or Julian Croft. She spoke of a person of interest in a sensitive local matter, Elias Vance, who was making a series of suspicious, untraceable offshore payments to a firm in Zurich. She mentioned the name, Aletheia Digital Solutions, and Thorne went quiet on the other end of the line. Aletheia, he finally said, his tone shifting from friendly to cautious. You're kicking a hornet's nest, Eva. They don't just work for rich businessmen. They work for oligarchs, rogue states. They clean up digital messes for some of the most dangerous people in the world. Which is why I'm calling you, Rostova said smoothly. These payments look a lot like money laundering. I thought it might be something your office would find interesting. There was another long pause. I can't promise anything, Thorne said, but the name has been flagged before. I'll poke around, see what shakes loose. Don't expect to hear from me soon. These things take time. The call ended. They had a hook in the water, but it was in a deep and dangerous ocean. While they waited for a fish to bite, they couldn't afford to be idle. If the feds are handling the money, we go back to the man, Callahan declared back in the squad room. Vance lied about the audio file. What else did he lie about? Let's rebuild his entire life for the last 20 years. Find the other cracks. It was tedious, painstaking work. Miller dove back into the data, cross-referencing travel itineraries, financial statements, and public records. She built a timeline, a digital map of a man's life. As expected, she found records of 3 separate trips Vance had taken to Zurich in the last year, corroborating their theory that he had met with Alethea in person to orchestrate the deepfake. But then, she found something else. Something that didn't fit the narrative of a ruthless corporate shark. Jack, look at this, she said, pointing to a section of a financial spreadsheet. It was a recurring monthly payment, routed from a private philanthropic fund Vance controlled. It wasn't a huge amount, not compared to the millions he was moving elsewhere, but it was consistent, paid every month for 20 years. The recipient was a discreet, upscale facility an hour outside of Veridia City called the Briarwood Retreat. A resort. Jack asked. Not exactly, Miller replied, pulling up the facility's website. It was a private, long-term psychiatric hospital, specializing in trauma and acute psychological distress. They hit another wall. Patient records were even more protected than Swiss bank accounts. They couldn't just call and ask who Elias Vance was paying for. But Callahan, a man who knew the city's bureaucracy inside and out, had an idea. The county regulates private health facilities, he said. They require a guarantor on file for all long-term patients, in case the primary payment source dries up. Let's see if we can get a look at their records. It took a called-in favor to an old contact in the county clerk's office and a carefully worded request about a fictitious billing audit, but an hour later, a file was securely emailed to Miller's computer. It was a list of all guarantors for patients at Briarwood. Miller scrolled down the list, her eyes scanning for Vance's name. Here he is, she said. Elias Vance. Guarantor. For who? Jack asked, leaning over her shoulder. Patient is listed as Jane Doe, Miller read aloud, her brow furrowing. No name. But there's an admission date. She fell silent, her eyes wide with shock. She looked at Jack, a new, unnerving mystery dawning between them. The patient, this Jane Doe, she said, her voice barely a whisper, was admitted to Briarwood 20 years ago, less than a month after Eliza Vance died. The revelation landed with a quiet thud. Elias Vance, the man of secrets and lies, had another one, a big one. For 2 decades, he had been secretly paying for the care of a mystery woman, a ghost from the same period of time that had defined his entire life. Who was she? And why had he hidden her away for 20 years? The case had just taken another sharp, dark turn into the unknown. The name Jane Doe hung in the air between Callahan and Miller, a new ghost joining the ever-growing cast of their investigation. The admission date was the key, a lock clicking into place, connecting this mystery woman to the original, primal crime. It can't be a coincidence, Miller said, her voice low. 20 years. Admitted right after Eliza's death. Paid for by Elias Vance. This isn't a loose end, Jack. This is a secret he's been keeping longer than any other. A witness, Jack theorized, his mind sifting through dark possibilities. Someone who saw the hit and run? And instead of killing them, Vance locked them away in a psychiatric hospital to silence them. It's monstrous, Miller whispered. But it fits the man we're starting to uncover. A man who would fake a confession to seize a company wouldn't think twice about burying a witness in a place like this. They knew a direct approach was impossible. The Briarwood Retreat was a fortress of medical privacy and wealth. A legal warrant to unseal the records of an unknown patient would be a bureaucratic nightmare that would tip Vance off immediately. They had to go old school. They needed eyes on the ground. The Briarwood Retreat was nestled in a valley of rolling green hills, looking more like a university campus or a luxury spa than a hospital. The lawns were immaculate, the buildings were made of calming, natural stone, and the perimeter was secured by a high, wrought iron fence. It was a beautiful, tranquil prison. For 2 days, they sat in their unmarked car on a hill overlooking the main gate, a thermos of stale coffee their only comfort. They watched the staff come and go, the delivery trucks, the occasional, expensive car gliding through the gates for a discreet visit. It was mind-numbingly dull, But patience was a detective's most underrated tool. On the third day, Jack decided to change tactics. "I'm going in," he said, posing as a concerned brother looking for a place for his troubled sister. He played the part perfectly. An hour later, he returned to the car with a glossy brochure and a trove of new intelligence gleaned from a conversation with a senior nurse named Gable, a kind-eyed woman who had worked at Briarwood for nearly 30 years. "Her name is Martha Gable," Jack reported as he slid back into the driver's seat. "She remembers when our Jane Doe was admitted. She said it was a tragic case. The patient was brought in by a private ambulance in the middle of the night. Severe physical and psychological trauma from what they were told was a terrible car accident. She's been almost completely non-communicative ever since." "Did she give you a description?" Miller asked. "Just that she was young at the time. But she did mention one thing," Jack said, his eyes narrowing. "The patient arrived with nothing but the clothes on her back and a small, silver locket clutched in her hand. Nurse Gable said that in all her years there, the woman has never let it go." The silver locket. The same locket with the initials EV that they had found in Julian Croft's secret safe. The shrine he had built wasn't for a dead woman. It was for a ghost that was still living. The true breakthrough came late on the fourth afternoon. A sleek, black town car with tinted windows purred up to the gate and was admitted without pause. Miller ran the license plate. It was registered to a private car service, but the account belonged to the office of the CEO of Nexus Dynamics, Elias Vance. "He's here," Jack said, a surge of adrenaline cutting through the boredom. "He's visiting his secret." They watched, hidden, as the car disappeared toward a secluded wing of the hospital. It remained for less than an hour before re-emerging and sweeping back out onto the main road. The visit was brief, efficient, and cold. "Now's our chance," Miller said. She had a plan. She walked up to the main reception building, looking frantic. She claimed she had been there with her brother, Jack, earlier in the week and had lost a sentimental earring during their tour. While the receptionist was distracted, checking the lost and found and making a sympathetic phone call, Miller slipped down a hallway, following the signs to the long-term residence wing that Nurse Gable had pointed out to Jack. She moved quickly and quietly, her heart pounding. She found the patient's room at the end of a deserted corridor. The nameplate on the door was blank. Peering through the small, reinforced glass window, she saw a woman sitting in a padded armchair, staring out at the manicured lawn. Her back was mostly to the door. She was older, her hair now gray, her posture listless. Then, the woman shifted, turning slightly toward the light. She raised a hand to her neck, her fingers absently tracing the chain of a tarnished silver locket. And Miller saw her face. Time seemed to stop. Miller felt the air leave her lungs, a gasp catching in her throat. Her mind struggled to process what her eyes were seeing. The face was older, haunted by 2 decades of trauma and medication, the features slack and devoid of emotion. But it was unmistakable. The bone structure, the shape of the eyes, the curve of her mouth. She had stared at that same face in dozens of photographs. The laughing girl on the college campus. The bright, vibrant young woman who was the catalyst for everything. It was Eliza Vance. The woman who had been identified by her own brother, pronounced dead and buried 20 years ago, was alive. Miller stumbled back from the door, her mind reeling from the sheer, earth-shattering impossibility of it. Every fact, every motive, every piece of their case had been built upon the foundation of her death. Mark Jennings's 20-year quest for revenge. Elias Vance's blackmail. Croft's guilt. All of it was a lie. A terrifying question began to form in her mind, a question that threatened to unravel the very fabric of reality as they knew it. If Eliza Vance is alive, then who did they bury in her grave? Detective Miller stumbled away from the patient's door, her hand pressed against her mouth as if to stifle a scream. She made her way back down the sterile, silent corridor in a daze, her mind a maelstrom of impossible images. The haunted, vacant face. The silver locket. Eliza Vance. Alive. She collapsed into the passenger seat of their car, her face ashen. Jack took one look at her and knew instantly that she had seen a ghost. "Miller, what is it? What did you see?" he asked, his voice sharp with alarm. "It's her, Jack," she whispered, her voice trembling. "The Jane Doe in that room. It's Eliza Vance. I saw her face. I saw the locket. It's her." Callahan stared at her, his logical, world-weary detective's mind rejecting the very premise. "That's not possible, Maria. She's dead. She's been dead for 20 years. Is she?" Miller shot back, her shock hardening into a terrifying certainty. Or is that just the story Elias Vance wanted everyone to believe? The drive back to Veridia City was shrouded in a stunned silence. The implications of what Miller had seen were so monstrous, so profound, that they were difficult to process. If Eliza was alive, then the entire narrative of their case, the central tragedy that had fueled a 20-year vendetta and a multi-million-dollar blackmail scheme, was a lie. Markham Jennings had murdered a man in the name of a dead woman who was still breathing. Elias Vance hadn't just covered up a crime, he had orchestrated a deception of unimaginable cruelty. Their first stop was Captain Rostova's office. It was well past midnight when they laid out the unbelievable new reality. Rostova, who thought she had heard everything in her 30-year career, was rendered speechless. She listened, her face a mask of stone, as they told her about Briarwood, the secret patient, and Miller's impossible visual identification. "He let a man rot with vengeance for 20 years, Rostova said, her voice dangerously quiet. "He let his friends, his own family, mourn a ghost. All while he had his sister locked away. The man is a monster." She stood up, pacing her office. But a visual ID after 2 decades of trauma isn't enough to get a warrant. We need more. We need undeniable, concrete proof before we can touch Vance or that hospital. "We go back to the beginning," Jack said, his mind already working. "To the original sin. The hit and run. The body that Elias identified as his sister. There has to be a flaw in the record. Something they missed." Back in the fluorescent hum of the empty squad room, Miller dove into the city's digital archives, pulling the complete 20-year-old case file on the death of Eliza Vance. They scrolled through grainy crime scene photos, witness statements, and procedural reports. Then they found the original autopsy report, a scanned PDF of a document typed on an old word processor. They read it line by line, searching for a crack in the official story. Most of it was standard, cause of death, toxicology. But then, Jack saw it. A single, overlooked sentence in the medical examiner's notes. "Here," he said, pointing to a paragraph. Miller zoomed in. The ME from 2 decades ago had written, "Victim suffered significant cranial and facial trauma, rendering visual identification challenging. Positive identification was made by the victim's brother and next of kin. Note, a small, well-healed surgical scar, approximately 3 centimeters in length, was observed on the victim's left patella." "A surgical scar," Miller breathed. "I'll pull Eliza Vance's medical records from the university. See if she ever had knee surgery." It took her less than 5 minutes. Eliza Vance's student health records were sparse but complete. She'd had wisdom teeth removed and been treated for the flu once. There was no record of any surgeries. No mention of a scar on her knee. It was the piece they needed. The inconsistency. The single, overlooked detail from 20 years ago that could unravel everything. Elias Vance had identified a body that had a physical characteristic his sister did not possess. "This is our probable cause," Jack said, a grim sense of purpose settling over him. "This, combined with our surveillance of Vance at Briarwood and the financial link, is enough." Their next stop was the home of a night court judge, a man woken from his sleep to hear the most outlandish story of his career. In a stuffy, book-lined study, Jack and Miller laid out their case. They told him about the murder of Julian Croft, the confession of Markham Jennings, the deep-fake audio, the Swiss firm, the secret psychiatric patient, and finally, the 2-decade-old coroner's report with its crucial contradictory detail. The judge listened, his expression shifting from irritation to skepticism, and finally, to a look of profound disturbance. He read the documents they provided, his eyes lingering on the old autopsy notes. He was silent for what felt like an eternity. "You are asking me to sign an order to exhume a body," the judge said slowly, his voice heavy with the gravity of the request. "To disturb a grave based on a theory that defies belief. If you are wrong, detectives, the fallout from this will end your careers. You know that, right?" "We know, Your Honor," Callahan said, his voice steady. "But a woman's life, and a man's motive for murder, have been built on a lie. We have to know the truth." The judge stared at the papers, then at the 2 determined detectives before him. He picked up a heavy, official-looking pen, uncapped it, and with a flourish of his signature and a hard press of his official stamp, he signed the warrant. "God help you if you're wrong," he said, sliding the document across his desk. Jack took the signed order. It felt heavy in his hand, a piece of paper that gave them the power to literally dig up the past. Their next stop was the Veridia City cemetery. They were going to ask a 20-year-old corpse to tell them its name. The dawn broke over Veridia City Cemetery, a reluctant gray light filtering through a thick blanket of morning mist. The air was cold and damp, smelling of wet earth and old stone. It was a somber, silent place, a world away from the city's frantic energy. For detectives Callahan and Miller, it felt like the most fitting crime scene yet. They stood at a respectful distance, their breath pluming in the air, and watched the city's exhumation team work with practiced, grim efficiency. The quiet sounds of shovels biting into damp soil were the only ones that disturbed the peace of the dead. This was the final visceral step in unwinding Elias Vance's 20-year lie. They were literally digging for the truth. The moment the crane lifted the tarnished, soil-caked casket from the earth was one of profound, heavy silence. This box contained the answer to a question they hadn't even known to ask a week ago. It held the body of a ghost, the unknown victim whose stolen identity had fueled 2 decades of grief, rage, and ultimately, murder. At the city morgue, the atmosphere was sterile and clinical, a sharp contrast to the cemetery's gothic gloom. The new chief medical examiner, a sharp, no-nonsense woman named Dr. Chen, met them. "The remains are consistent with a 20-year interment," she began, all business. "The cause of death is clearly massive blunt force trauma, consistent with the original hit-and-run report. Now, for the reason we're all here." She gestured towards a high-resolution X-ray on a light box. "Take a look at the left patella. You can clearly see the drill holes and surgical anchors from a significant knee operation. The scar noted in the old report was just the external evidence. This individual had major reconstructive surgery on that knee at some point." "Eliza Vance's medical records show no such surgery," Miller confirmed. "Then this is not Eliza Vance," Dr. Chin stated simply. "We've taken a DNA sample from the bone marrow. The lab is running it through the National Missing Persons database now. If there's a match, we'll find it." The wait was agonizing. Back at the precinct, Callahan and Miller drank bitter coffee and stared at the whiteboard, now covered in a web of interconnected names, lies, and timelines that seemed to grow more complex by the hour. "The coldness of it, Jack," Miller said, shaking her head. "To identify a stranger as your own sister. To bury her under Eliza's name. And then to lock the real Eliza away. Who does that?" "Someone who needed the world to believe his sister was dead," Jack reasoned. "Someone whose plans required a martyr. He didn't just hide Eliza. He used her death as a shield, as leverage, as a story. And he let another family wonder what happened to their daughter for 20 years. The phone on Miller's desk rang, jarring the silence. It was the forensics lab. Miller listened, her expression growing taut, her knuckles white as she gripped the receiver. She hung up without saying a word, her eyes wide. "They got a match," she said, her voice strained. She turned to her computer, her fingers typing quickly as she pulled up the file the lab had just sent over. A 20-year-old missing persons report appeared on the screen, complete with a dated, slightly grainy photograph. The report was for a young woman with a kind, smiling face and dark, curly hair. Her name was Sarah Jenkins. She was 19 years old. Callahan leaned closer, his eyes scanning the text of the report, a cold dread washing over him as he read the details. Sarah Jenkins, a student from a neighboring state, was reported missing by her parents 2 decades ago. The last place she was seen alive was at a party at Veridia University, where she was visiting for the weekend. He scrolled down to the final, damning piece of information on the form. The name of the relative she was visiting. The person who was the last to see her. Her cousin, Markham Jennings. The truth crashed down upon them with the force of a physical blow. The hit and run. Julian Croft, drunk and enraged after his fight with Eliza, had stormed out and gotten behind the wheel. The person he struck and killed wasn't Eliza. It was Sarah Jenkins, Mark's cousin, who must have left the party around the same time. And Elias Vance, in a moment of unimaginably cruel, opportunistic genius, had seen his chance. He had found the body, seen the opportunity to create a tragedy he could control. He had identified Sarah's body as Eliza's, creating a martyr and shackling a guilt-ridden Croft to him forever. He had hidden away his traumatized sister, and in doing so, had allowed Markham Jennings's grief and rage to fester, pointing it like a weapon at Julian Croft. Mark had spent 20 years of his life, a self-imposed exile, dedicating his existence to avenging the death of Eliza Vance. But he had been a puppet all along. The ultimate victim of Elias Vance's master manipulation. The woman he had truly been avenging, the family member whose death had gone unpunished, was buried under the wrong name in a cold, forgotten grave. Callahan looked at Miller, the full, horrifying weight of their discovery settling upon them. Their next duty was clear. It was also going to be the hardest conversation of their careers. "We have to tell him," Jack said, his voice heavy. "We have to go back to that cell and tell Markham Jennings who he really killed Julian Croft for." The drive to the Federal Detention Center was the quietest of their careers. There was no strategy to discuss, no theory to debate. There was only the heavy, oppressive weight of the truth they carried. They were about to visit a confessed murderer, a man who believed his life's singular, violent act had been a righteous execution, and inform him that his entire existence was a tragic, misdirected lie. There was no manual for a conversation like this. Markham Jennings was led into the sterile, white interview room. He had the same unnerving calm as before, the quiet resignation of a man who had made his peace with the consequences of his actions. He sat down opposite them, his hands resting on the steel table, and waited. "We didn't expect to see you again," he said, his voice even. "Have the legal mechanics become too confusing?" Callahan ignored the intellectual jab. He decided that a truth this brutal could not be softened. It had to be delivered like a surgeon's cut, clean and deep. "We need to talk about Eliza Vance, Mark," Callahan began. Mark's expression didn't change. "Her chapter is closed." "I closed it." "No," Callahan said, his voice flat. "You didn't. We've continued the investigation. We found her." A flicker of confusion crossed Mark's face. "Found her? She's buried in Veridia Cemetery." "She's not," Callahan stated, letting the words hang in the air. "The body in that grave is not Eliza. We exhumed it. We have proof. Mark, Eliza Vance is alive." The reaction was not what they expected. Mark didn't shout. He didn't rage. A slow, incredulous smile spread across his face. "A psychological game, detective? Trying to break the stoic killer? It's a tired trope. Do better." "This isn't a game," Miller said, her voice firm. She quickly and clinically laid out the facts: the Briarwood retreat, her visual identification, the 20-year-old coroner's report, the surgical scar, the signed exhumation order. As she spoke, Mark's cynical smile faltered. As a historian, he was a man who respected evidence, who built his worldview on verifiable facts. And the facts Miller was presenting were forming an undeniable, logical chain that was pulling the entire foundation of his life apart. The anger he had expected didn't come. It was replaced by a look of profound, sickening confusion. "If that wasn't Eliza in the grave," he whispered, his mind struggling to grasp the implications, "then my entire life, my purpose." He trailed off, the horrifying emptiness of his actions beginning to dawn on him. But Callahan knew the final, most devastating blow was yet to fall. He slid a thin file across the steel table. "We identified the body you've been avenging for 20 years, Mark," Callahan said, his voice softer now, tinged with a reluctant pity. "Open it." With a trembling hand, Mark Jennings opened the file. On top was the missing persons report, and clipped to it was the smiling, youthful photograph of his cousin, Sarah Jenkins. He stared at the photo. The world seemed to stop. The blood drained from his face. The name, the face, a memory from a lifetime ago. Sarah, his younger cousin, who had looked up to him, who had come to visit him for a weekend of parties and fun before she started her own college career. He hadn't thought of her in years, her memory lost in the all-consuming fire of his singular obsession. He made a sound, a low, guttural noise of pure, primal agony that came from the depths of his soul. The stoic philosopher, the patient historian, the righteous king-slayer, they all shattered in an instant, leaving only a man, broken and lost in a tidal wave of grief he never knew he was supposed to feel. He remembered her laugh. He remembered her asking him about his classes. He remembered waving goodbye to her as she left the party, just moments after Eliza had stormed out. The truth was a physical poison, convulsing through him. The woman Julian Croft had killed was his own family. The life he had thrown away, the man he had murdered, the 20 years of cold monastic rage, it was all for the wrong ghost. He hadn't been an agent of justice. He had been a fool. A pawn in a game so cruel and complex he had never even seen the board. His head fell into his hands, and a sob tore through him, the sound of a life's purpose turning to ash. He had murdered a man to avenge a lie, while his own cousin lay buried under a false name, her memory erased, her true fate unknown to her family. Callahan and Miller stood up and walked out, leaving the weeping man with the guards. The emotional devastation in that room was a tangible thing, and it followed them out into the cold, impersonal hallway. The pity they felt for the broken man was quickly eclipsed by a new, white-hot fury. They had just witnessed the true cost of Elias Vance's machinations, the absolute human ruin he had left in his wake. As they stepped out of the detention center into the fading afternoon light, all the moral ambiguity of the case fell away. There was no more complexity. There was only one target. One monster. Callahan looked at Miller, his eyes as hard and cold as a winter sky. "Now," he said, his voice a low promise of retribution. "We go for the real king." The rage that Callahan and Miller carried out of the federal detention center was a cold, quiet, and supremely focused thing. It was no longer just about solving a case. It was about dismantling a monster. Back in Captain Rostova's office, the three of them stood before the whiteboard, which now looked like the ravings of a madman, a twisted family tree of lies, faked deaths, and manipulated lives. Markham Jennings's confession will convict him of killing Croft, Rostova began, her voice clipped and hard. But he's not the architect of this. Elias Vance is. What can we charge him with? 20 years ago? Obstruction, falsifying a police report, tampering with a corpse, Miller listed. But the statute of limitations may have run out on some of those. And proving them would mean reopening a case file that's been cold for 2 decades. And the deep fake? Callahan added. He used it to defraud Croft of $10 million and a $1 billion company. But he has immunity for the blackmail. The DA gave him a deal. A deal predicated on a fraudulent testimony, Rostova countered, a dangerous glint in her eye. A deal we can now prove was based on a lie. But to break that deal, we need an earthquake. We need a witness. We need Eliza. Their objective became singular and absolute. They had to get to Eliza Vance. Legally. They needed to prove to a judge that the Jane Doe in Briarwood was the missing girl, and that she was a material witness and a victim of a crime so profound it had been kept hidden for 20 years. Armed with the official ME report from the exhumation, which formally identified the buried victim as Sarah Jenkins, they went back to the night court judge. This time, there was no skepticism in his eyes. There was only a look of horrified astonishment as they laid out the final, terrible pieces of the puzzle. They weren't just asking to speak to a patient anymore. They were asking the court to seize custody of a woman held in a private prison for 2 decades under a false identity, a woman whose brother was the architect of her captivity. The judge signed the order without hesitation. It gave them full authority to enter Briarwood, confirm the patient's identity, and place her under the protection of the state, effectively severing Elias Vance's control over her for the first time in 20 years. The next move was a declaration of war. 2 uniformed officers, accompanied by a city attorney, walked into the pristine, top-floor office of the new CEO of Nexus Dynamics. In the middle of a board meeting, they served a stunned Elias Vance with the court order. Witnesses later described his reaction as one of absolute, chilling stillness. The friendly, grieving mask was gone, replaced by the cold reptilian fury of a king whose most secure fortress had just been breached. He didn't speak. He simply took the papers and called his lawyer. The battle had begun. Hours later, Callahan and Miller walked through the front doors of the Briarwood retreat. They no longer had to sneak or pretend. They held the power of the court in their hands. The hospital administrator, a man who had clearly received a frantic call from Vance's legal team, met them with a face like thunder, but had no choice but to comply. The patient is in her room. She is fragile, the administrator said stiffly. A state-appointed physician is on her way to assess her. We'll see her now, Callahan said, his tone leaving no room for debate. They were escorted down the same quiet, sterile hallway Miller had snuck through days before. The administrator unlocked the door to the room with the blank nameplate and pushed it open. He did not enter. Callahan and Miller stepped inside. The room was simple, comfortable, but felt devoid of life. And there she was, sitting in the armchair by the window, a frail figure silhouetted against the afternoon light. Her hair was gray and thin, her body gaunt under a simple cotton gown. She was staring out at the trees, her expression utterly vacant, a ghost lost between worlds. The room was so quiet they could hear the soft ticking of a clock on the wall. They stood there for a long moment, unsure of how to approach a soul that had been buried for 2 decades. Finally, Jack took a slow, deliberate step forward. He spoke softly, his voice gentle, stripped of all its usual gravelly authority. "Eliza," he said, "my name is Detective Callahan. This is my partner, Detective Miller. We're with the police." There was no reaction. The woman continued to stare out the window, her gaze fixed on something far away, or perhaps on nothing at all. Her hands lay limp in her lap, her fingers loosely entwined around the tarnished silver locket. Jack took another step. "We know what happened, Eliza," he said, his voice still a near whisper. "We know what your brother did. We're here to help you. You're safe now. Nothing." The silence stretched, thick with a sense of hopelessness. Was she too far gone? Had 20 years of trauma and medication erased the woman she once was completely? Callahan was about to turn to Miller, to concede that this might be a dead end, when he saw it. A flicker of movement. The woman's fingers, which had been still, slowly, almost imperceptibly, tightened their grip around the silver locket. Her knuckles, frail and bony, turned white with the pressure. Then, with an effort that seemed to take all the strength she possessed, her head began to turn. The movement was agonizingly slow, the motion of a statue coming to life. Her vacant eyes, which had been fixed on the window for what seemed like an eternity, shifted. They moved past the furniture, past the walls, and finally, for the first time in 20 years, they landed on the face of another person. They landed on his. There was no recognition in them, no understanding, but there was a flicker, a tiny, undeniable spark in the deep, haunted darkness. A sign that somewhere, buried under a mountain of pain and silence, a witness was still there. The spark in Eliza Vance's eyes lasted only a moment before the veil of vacancy descended again, but it was enough. It was a signal fire from a soul lost in a 20-year fog. Callahan and Miller held their ground, not moving, not wanting to break the fragile, momentous connection. Their quiet vigil was interrupted by the arrival of Dr. Eris Thorne, the state-appointed psychiatrist. She was a woman with a calm, commanding presence, her sharp, empathetic eyes taking in the scene. The two detectives, the ghost in the chair, with a practiced glance. After a brief introduction, she asked the detectives to wait outside while she conducted her initial assessment. When she emerged an hour later, her expression was a mixture of professional anger and profound sadness. "I've reviewed her chart history from Briarwood," Dr. Thorne said, her voice tight. "For 20 years, this woman has been subjected to a regimen of heavy-duty antipsychotics and sedatives. The dosage is unconscionable. It's not treatment, it's chemical imprisonment. They kept her in a constant state of docility." "Can you reach her, doctor?" Miller asked, the hope in her voice fragile. "Can she testify to what happened to her?" "Honestly, detective, I don't know," Dr. Thorne admitted, her gaze unwavering. "The human mind can heal in remarkable ways, but 2 decades of trauma, compounded by this level of iatrogenic harm caused by the treatment itself, is a monumental obstacle. Our first step is to move her to a secure state facility where we can begin to safely detoxify her system. Then, and only then, will we see who is left underneath." She looked at them with a new respect. "You didn't just uncover a crime. You staged a rescue mission." The rescue mission immediately came under fire. As soon as Eliza was transferred under state custody, Elias Vance unleashed the full, terrifying power of his legal team. A barrage of motions and injunctions flooded the DA's office and the court. His lawyers argued that a vulnerable, mentally ill woman was being cruelly exploited by reckless detectives on a baseless fishing expedition. They claimed the state's intervention was causing her immense distress and demanded her immediate return to the stable and familiar environment of Briarwood. Captain Rostova called Callahan and Miller into her office. A thick legal brief slammed on her desk. "Vance is trying to bury us in paper," she said, her jaw tight. "He's painting us as the villains. The judge is getting nervous. He's given us 1 week. 1 week to show concrete progress that this is a viable witness, or he's going to grant Vance's motion and send her back." The clock was ticking. Every day for the next 4 days, Callahan and Miller visited Eliza in her new room at the state facility. It was a sunnier space, less opulent than Briarwood, but more human. Dr. Thorne was slowly weaning her off the powerful drugs, and the physical effects were noticeable. A slight tremor in her hands was gone, and there was a hint of color in her cheeks. But she remained silent, a ship lost in a sea of fog, giving no sign that she was aware of their presence. On the 5th day, with their time running out, Callahan made a desperate decision. "We're not getting through," he said to Miller on the drive over. "We're just 2 strangers in a room. We need to give her a piece of her own past. Something to hold on to." He signed out the evidence from Julian Croft's secret safe. The faded photographs. The pressed daisy. The movie ticket. In Eliza's room, with Dr. Thorne observing from a corner, Callahan carefully laid the items from the memory box on the small table in front of her chair. "We thought you might want to see these, Eliza," he said gently. "They belong to a friend of yours, Julian Croft." For a long time, there was nothing. Eliza's gaze remained distant, unfocused. The precious days they had left were slipping away into another silent dead end. Jack felt a crushing sense of defeat. He had gambled and lost. He was about to gather the items when he saw her hand move. It was a slow, tentative motion, a hesitant reach across the gulf of 20 years. Her fingers brushed against the photographs, then passed over the dried flower. Her gaze, previously vacant, seemed to fixate on the small, faded piece of cardboard. The ticket stub for a movie called Summer's End. Her lips, which had not formed a word in 2 decades, trembled. She took a shallow, shaky breath, and a sound, a dry, raspy whisper, emerged from her throat. It was faint, almost inaudible, but to the 3 other people in that room, it was as loud as a cannon blast. "Sarah." The name of the dead girl. The name of Markham Jennings's cousin. It was the first word she had spoken. A name from the night her life had been shattered. It was a key turning in a lock that had been rusted shut for 20 years. It was proof. She was in there. The witness was alive. And she was beginning to remember. The single whispered word from Eliza Vance echoed in the quiet room with the force of a thunderclap. Sarah. It was a ghost finding its voice, a confirmation, a key. Dr. Thorne moved forward, her expression one of intense, cautious focus, while Callahan and Miller held their breath, rooted to the spot. The fragile bubble of the moment felt like it could pop at any second. Dr. Thorne knelt beside Eliza's chair. Eliza, she said, her voice incredibly soft. That's right. Sarah. Can you tell us about Sarah? But the connection was severed as quickly as it had formed. A look of terror flashed in Eliza's eyes, the memory seemingly too painful to hold. She withdrew, her gaze retreating back to the safety of the void, her hand falling limp in her lap, though her fingers remained clenched around the locket. The window had closed. But they all knew it could be opened again. That's enough for today, Dr. Thorne said, standing up and ushering the detectives out of the room. But that was monumental. It's the first time she has externally referenced a specific memory from the trauma. This is the breakthrough you needed. Armed with this, they went to war. In an emergency hearing the next morning, the city's attorney presented Dr. Thorne's sworn affidavit to the judge. It stated that the patient, identified as Eliza Vance, had, for the first time in 20 years, spoken an unprompted word directly related to the now identified victim of a cold case homicide. Elias Vance's team of high-priced lawyers fought back furiously, arguing it was a coerced, meaningless utterance from a severely ill woman. But the judge, his patience with Vance's manipulations clearly gone, was convinced. He slammed his gavel down, denying Vance's motion and granting the state an indefinite extension of custody for their material witness. They had won. They had time. The days that followed were a slow, painstaking exercise in psychological archaeology. Under Dr. Thorne's expert guidance, they began the delicate process of excavating a buried mind. They didn't push. They didn't interrogate. They created a safe space, visiting every day, speaking in calm tones. They used the name Sarah as their anchor. We know you were friends with Sarah, Miller would say gently, showing her the photograph of the two of them on the park bench. It's okay to remember her. At first, Eliza's responses were nonverbal. A flicker of her eyes. A slight nod. But slowly, tentatively, the words began to come, like spring shoots pushing through frozen ground. They were fragmented, broken pieces of a nightmare. The party, too loud, she whispered one afternoon, her gaze fixed on the photo. Sarah wanted to leave. We went for a walk. Another day, she remembered more. Headlights, so bright. A car, coming so fast. Her breathing would quicken, her knuckles white on the arms of her chair. Dr. Thorne was always there to calm her, to bring her back from the edge. They knew Julian Croft was the driver. They knew Sarah Jenkins was the victim. The great, unanswered question was the one they were almost afraid to ask. What was Elias Vance's role? One afternoon, Callahan took the risk. Eliza, he said, his voice steady. The car. Julian was driving. But was anyone else there? Was your brother Elias at the party? Eliza flinched at her brother's name. A cloud of fear passed over her face. She began to rock slightly, a low moan escaping her lips. They thought they had lost her, pushed too hard. But then she stopped. She looked at Callahan, her eyes suddenly, shockingly clear, focused with the clarity of a relived horror. Not at the party, she whispered, her voice cracking with a 20-year-old terror. In the car. Callahan and Miller exchanged a look, their blood turning to ice. He was in the car with Julian? Callahan pressed gently. She nodded, tears beginning to stream down her pale cheeks. The dam of her memory was breaking. Sarah screamed. Julian slammed on the brakes. He was crying. I hit her, I hit her. He was panicking. Her gaze became distant, seeing the scene play out before her. But Elias, he was quiet. He got out. He looked. He came back to the car. Julian was a mess. She clutched her locket, her body trembling. Elias got back in, she whispered, the final damning words tumbling out. He looked at Julian. His voice was so cold. He said, drive. He told him to keep driving. No one will know. Just drive. The truth was out. Elias Vance wasn't an accessory after the fact who stumbled upon a tragedy. He wasn't a mere opportunist. He was a participant. He was in the passenger seat, a cold, calculating co-conspirator who, in the immediate chaotic aftermath of the crime, took control and orchestrated the cover-up from the very first second. The immunity deal Vance had so cleverly negotiated was now worthless. It covered the blackmail he had confessed to, but it could not protect him from this, accessory to felony hit-and-run causing death, conspiracy, and 2 decades of obstruction. The detectives left the facility, the quiet hum of their car a stark contrast to the storm of adrenaline and purpose they felt. They had him. The real king. The puppet master who had pulled every string, destroyed every life, and built an empire on a foundation of unimaginable cruelty. Back at the precinct, they walked into Captain Rostova's office. "We have her testimony," Callahan said, his voice flat and hard. Vance was in the car. Rostova's eyes, which had been filled with weary frustration for weeks, now lit up with a cold, bright fire. She looked at her 2 exhausted, determined detectives. "You have your witness," she said. "You have your crime. Go get a warrant for his arrest. Let's end this." With Eliza's testimony, the entire machinery of the justice system, which had been stalled and misdirected for weeks, now engaged with unstoppable force. The district attorney, armed with a credible witness to a 20-year-old homicide, moved with the speed and ferocity of a shark that smells blood. The immunity deal with Elias Vance was rendered void, declared null by a judge on the grounds of fraudulent inducement. An arrest warrant was signed before sunrise. The hunt for the real king was on. They didn't go to his home. They went to his throne. The top floor of the Nexus Dynamics Tower, the office that had once belonged to Julian Croft. It was the heart of the empire Elias Vance had schemed, lied, and destroyed lives to obtain. It was there that he had to fall. Callahan and Miller, backed by 4 uniformed officers, stepped out of the elevator into the hushed, opulent world of the executive suite. Vance was in a meeting in a glass-walled conference room, commanding the attention of his board, looking every bit the untouchable titan of industry. He saw the detectives approaching, and a look of supreme annoyance crossed his face. He stood, clearly intending to dismiss them with a wave of his hand. But then he saw the uniforms, and the grim, unyielding purpose in Callahan's eyes. This wasn't a conversation. It was a reckoning. He met them just outside the conference room, his voice a low, threatening hiss. "This is beyond harassment. My lawyers will end your careers." "Your lawyers are a little busy trying to figure out how to defend an accessory to murder," Jack said, his voice flat. He held up the warrant. "Elias Vance, you are under arrest for your participation in the death of Sarah Jenkins, conspiracy, and 2 decades of obstructing justice." For the first time, Vance's mask of cold control was obliterated by pure, panicked shock. "That's insane," he stammered. "You have nothing." "We have everything," Miller said, her voice cutting through his denial like glass. "We have the body you misidentified. We have the cousin you manipulated. And we have the sister you buried alive." She took a step closer. "Eliza remembers, Elias. She remembers being in the car. She remembers you telling Julian to drive." The name, Eliza, spoken with such certainty, was the final blow. The fight went out of him. The intricate 20-year-old web of lies he had so masterfully woven had come undone, and he was hopelessly entangled within it. The king was naked. He was no longer a genius, a manipulator, or a CEO. He was just a criminal at the end of his reign. As the handcuffs clicked around his wrists, the board members stared in stunned silence through the glass wall. The walk back to the elevators, through the heart of the company he had stolen, was his final, silent parade. Elias Vance, the true silent king, was finally being brought out of his castle and into the light. The aftermath was a storm. The trial of Elias Vance was a sensation, a story of Shakespearean betrayal and cruelty. Eliza, though still fragile, found the strength to testify. Her quiet, halting words were the most powerful testimony the city had ever heard. Vance was convicted on all counts, his empire dismantled, his name forever synonymous with monstrous deception. Markham Jennings, his own confession now viewed in the tragic light of the truth, pleaded guilty to manslaughter. Given the extreme circumstances of Vance's manipulation, a judge sentenced him to the minimum term. In a quiet prison library months later, Callahan visited him one last time. The anger was gone from Mark's eyes, replaced by a deep, weary sadness. "I was a historian who never checked his primary source," he said quietly. "Thank you for showing me the truth, even if it was unbearable." He was finally at peace, his misdirected vengeance given a name and a context. Eliza's recovery was a slow, quiet journey. Miller would visit her sometimes at the state facility. She found her one afternoon in the garden, sketching the flowers in a small notebook. She wasn't the laughing girl from the old photos, and perhaps she never would be. But she was alive, and she was free. She looked up at Miller and gave a small, genuine smile. It was enough. Months later, the rain was falling on Veridia City again. It was the same cold, cynical rain from the beginning of the case, washing the grime from the streets. Callahan and Miller sat in their unmarked car, looking out at the glittering, rain-slicked skyline. The case was finally, truly, closed. A cryptic note, Miller said, almost to herself. Where the silent king watches, the shadow will fall. Turns out we were looking at the wrong king all along, Callahan replied, his gaze fixed on the Nexus Tower, now under new leadership. Croft was just the figurehead. Vance was the real silent king, watching his secrets, thinking his walls were high enough. But the shadow fell anyway, Miller said. They always do, Callahan said, a lifetime of experience in his voice. Sooner or later, they all do. He started the car, the windshield wipers beginning their steady, rhythmic slap. The city was full of secrets, a million stories hidden behind walls of glass and stone. But tonight, the scales felt balanced. The ghosts were quiet. And for a little while, at least, justice had been done.